What if you were thrown into a prison where your name alone could be your death sentence? Where disease, fear, and silence filled every breath, and the guillotine waited just beyond the walls. Could you survive even a single day inside a French Revolutionary prison? Take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support keeps the history alive, and more videos coming. Overcrowding was immediate and overwhelming. Cells meant for 4 or 5 might hold 20, 30, even more. There were no real beds, just straw, old mats, rotting blankets. Prisoners lay shoulder to shoulder on stone floors, barely able to stretch or turn. The air inside was thick, heavy with sweat, sickness, and the dampness of human breath. Ventilation was rare. Windows were small, barred, and often sealed. In summer, the heat was suffocating. In winter, the cold sank into bone. There was no silence, only coughing, groaning, arguments, whispers of fear. New arrivals were not separated. They were pressed into any space available. The young, the old, nobles, beggars, political prisoners, all packed together. There were no uniforms, only rags, worn clothes, or what you arrived in. To relieve yourself, there might be a shared bucket, emptied once a day, or not at all. The stench followed you, clung to your skin, your lungs, your food, and the food was barely food. Rations were inconsistent, sometimes a small loaf of coarse bread, other times a ladle of thin, greasy broth, rotting vegetables, insects, spoiled meat, all found their way into bowls. Some went days without receiving anything, depending on the guard's mood or your social status. Those who had money could bribe for better portions. Those without starved. Water was drawn from shared barrels, cloudy, reused, often contaminated. Many drank less, to avoid needing the latrine bucket. Diarrhea and vomiting were common. Dehydration was constant. And where there is poor food and worse hygiene, disease follows quickly. Typhus spread by lice, dysentery from unclean conditions, tuberculosis from the close quarters. Fevers swept through entire cell blocks, unchecked, untreated. There were no doctors, no medicine, no nurses. Sometimes a prisoner with medical knowledge was allowed to help, with no tools, no supplies, no aid. Sick inmates lay beside the dying, and beside those trying to sleep. Coughs racked bodies at night. Open sores festered. Skin turned yellow, pale, or purple. Many entered prison healthy, and died in days. There were no protections from pests. Lice bred in clothes and bedding. Rats ran openly along the walls, into food stores, over bodies at night, biting, gnawing, nesting. Some inmates began to hallucinate, driven mad by filth, noise, isolation. Some screamed through the night. Others sat motionless, rocking, whispering prayers, or names of loved ones. There was no schedule, no sense of time. Candles were limited, clocks forbidden. Days blurred together. Light dimmed early behind iron grates and mossy walls. You could be arrested for almost anything. Having noble blood, speaking against a Jacobin, being related to a landowner, even being too silent, or too friendly with the wrong person. Accusations were enough. Trials were rare, and verdicts swift. Sometimes there was no reason at all. A case of mistaken identity, or a need to fill quotas. You could be locked up, without knowing your charge, or your fate. Families were split, or imprisoned together. Children slept beside guillotine suspects. Women nursed infants in lice-ridden corners. Husbands and wives held hands across iron bars, awaiting news of death lists. There were spies inside the cells, fellow prisoners pretending to be allies, listening for suspicious words. Denouncements were rewarded, with food, freedom, or simply survival. Trust was dangerous. Silence was safer, but even silence could be misinterpreted. If you had property, it was taken. Jewelry, coins, watches, stripped on entry. Shoes, belts, even hair, removed for security. Those who resisted were beaten, or made examples of. Guards were not trained professionals. They were often thugs, revolutionaries, or criminals themselves. Some enjoyed their power. Others acted out of fear of being imprisoned themselves. Beatings were common. So were random inspections, forced labor, and humiliation. Women faced a different cruelty. Sexual abuse was frequent, rarely punished, and often hidden behind closed doors or silent threats. Pregnant women gave birth inside the prison. Newborns sometimes died before a name was chosen. Still, more prisoners arrived each week. Wagons rolled through streets at night, filled with new detainees, bound at the wrists. Crowds jeered, spat, or watched in silence. It was not just nobles or enemies of the revolution. It was anyone, and once inside, there was no clear path out. Each morning, names were read aloud. A list, held by a grim clerk, called with no emotion. If your name was on it, you were removed, taken to another cell, or directly to the cart. Some resisted, cried, begged. Others went quietly, in shock or prayer. Those left behind whispered about who might be next. No one knew how the list was made, who decided, or why. Rumors spread that certain words, behaviors, even dreams could lead to death, and the final journey was public. Prisoners were paraded through the streets in open carts. Children pointed, women wept, vendors shouted. The path to the guillotine was familiar. Blood-stained, littered with straw, and the scent of iron. Some were shaved beforehand, hair collected as property of the state. Others had their hands tied, or mouths gagged. The blade fell quickly, but the fear of it lasted for days, or weeks, or hours. Inside the walls of that prison, where no day was like the last, and no day was promised again. Executions happened so often. They became routine. During the height of the terror, dozens were guillotined daily. In Paris alone, thousands were processed through prisons like La Conciergerie, Saint-Pélagie, and the Luxembourg. Most of them never stood a real trial. The Revolutionary Tribunal operated swiftly, and with a single purpose, to eliminate enemies of the revolution. Evidence was minimal, sometimes just a rumor, or an accusation scrawled on a piece of paper. Judges were political agents, loyal to the Committee of Public Safety. Defending yourself was nearly impossible. Lawyers were discouraged from speaking too long, and were often targeted themselves if they showed sympathy. Even silence could be taken as admission of guilt. The courtroom was cramped, loud, and watched over by armed guards. Prisoners were brought in chained, malnourished, some too weak to stand. Verdicts were given in minutes. Death or acquittal, rarely anything else. And acquittal didn't always mean freedom. You could be returned to your cell, only to face new charges. Next day, sentences were carried out almost immediately. From the courtroom, to the prison yard, to the execution cart. There was no time for goodbyes. Public interest in executions was intense. Crowds gathered each day in the Place de la Révolution. Vendors sold wine, pastries, and pamphlets describing the day's victims. People brought their children, treated it as a spectacle, or a lesson. Some cheered, others wept. The guillotine stood tall and permanent. The scaffold was cleaned only when absolutely necessary. Blood soaked the straw beneath. The smell lingered for hours. Heads were held up by the executioner, then discarded in baskets. Bodies were taken to mass graves, piled together without ceremony. In the prison, the atmosphere shifted each time names were read. If your name was not called, you might feel relief, or guilt. Some prisoners celebrated survival. Others became numb. Hope was dangerous. Even if you believed your innocence would save you, it rarely did. Political shifts happened quickly. One week, Robespierre's supporters were in control. The next they were being dragged to the guillotine themselves. Allies became enemies overnight. Slogans changed, alliances broke, and prisoners paid the price. Many tried to write letters to family, but censors read every line. Anything suspicious was destroyed. and many letters were never delivered. Some wrote last wills, poems, confessions, hoping someone might remember them. Most of those pages were lost or burned. Even inside the prison, there was a hierarchy. Some had privileges, better food, private cells, access to books. These were usually the wealthy, or those with powerful friends outside. But even they were not safe. A bribe might buy you an extra blanket one night, and mean nothing the next day. Some cells became gathering places for discussion. Groups of aristocrats or intellectuals tried to maintain dignity, debating philosophy, history, politics. Others played cards, sang quietly, recited prayers. But as the weeks passed, even the most composed began to unravel. Madness was common. Men shouted to invisible figures. Women clutched dolls made of cloth scraps. Prisoners paced endlessly, or scratched words into the walls. Liberté, innocent, names of loved ones, dates they hoped to remember. One of the greatest fears was to be forgotten, and many were, once executed. Your name might appear briefly in a printed list, then disappear forever. Some left no records at all, no trial transcript, no gravestone, no acknowledgement, only the memory of their screams, their silence, or their absence from the morning roll call. Inside the prison, time lost all meaning. There was no sunrise or sunset, just the occasional shaft of light through dirty glass. Days were marked only by meals, footsteps in the corridor, or the sound of keys turning in iron locks. The guards rotated frequently, to prevent prisoners from gaining sympathy or trust. Each new face brought uncertainty. Would this one beat you, or ignore you? Would they whisper your name to the tribunal, or forget you entirely? Even sleep was not safe. Midnight arrests were common. Torches and boots in the hallway, the sound of someone being dragged out, the screams, the begging, and then silence. Everyone else lay still, pretending not to hear, trying not to be next. There were rumors, always rumors, of escape attempts, of bribed guards, of tunnels beneath the floor. Most were false, and those who tried were caught and punished publicly. Some chose to take their own lives, rather than wait for the blade. They were found in the morning, hanging from window bars, poisoned with hidden herbs, their wrists opened with broken pottery. There was no escape from the fear, no comfort in innocence, and no justice, only the rhythm of death, the creak of the cartwheels, the drop of the blade, and the silence that followed. One of the most unsettling aspects was how easily someone could be imprisoned. There was no need for hard evidence, or even suspicion, in the modern sense. A neighbor's complaint, a political joke overheard, a forgotten friendship with a noble, any of these could result in a knock at your door, and an order of arrest. There were thousands of denunciations, written by hand, delivered anonymously. Some were motivated by fear, some by jealousy, others by ambition. In revolutionary France, being accused was almost the same as being guilty. Once your name was written down, it entered a growing list held by the Committee of Public Safety. No one was exempt. Former revolutionaries, judges, generals, even members of the convention itself were imprisoned. Friendship with the wrong person, or failure to cheer at the right moment, could cost your life. There was no time to explain, and no one to explain to. The arresting officers followed simple orders: seize the individual, confiscate property, escort to prison. Many were taken at night, without warning, dragged from their beds, given no time to gather belongings, no moment to say goodbye. Families watched, helplessly, as fathers, mothers, siblings were led away. Sometimes, the entire household was arrested, including children, servants, and elderly relatives. Once inside the prison, you became a number, a name on a page. The outside world ceased to matter, and yet, the walls of the prison echoed with rumors of what was happening beyond them. The revolution was eating itself, purging its own leaders, redrawing lines of loyalty, weekly. One faction accused another, then fell to the same blade weeks later. This instability infected the prisons. One day you might be on a list for release. The next, your name might be read aloud for execution. The legal system, as it existed, was a tool of terror, not justice. The law of suspects, passed in 1793, gave authorities broad powers to arrest anyone considered an enemy of liberty. That included nobles, émigrés, priests, hoarders, and those who showed bad citizenship. But the definition of that term was fluid. A former servant who inherited a coat of fine wool could be targeted. A merchant who failed to display revolutionary slogans in his shop window might be taken. Wearing black could be interpreted as mourning the king. Too much enthusiasm for the revolution could seem suspiciously performative. Too little could be fatal. There was no escape from the web of surveillance. Every citizen was expected to watch others and report disloyalty. Not doing so could itself be cause for arrest. Inside prison walls, this paranoia continued. Prisoners monitored each other, questioned new arrivals, speculated about who might be an informant. Sometimes, they guessed correctly. Spies were planted by the authorities to draw out subversive statements or plans, but often accusations were made without basis, just to deflect attention or earn favors from guards. This constant mistrust wore away the humanity of those imprisoned. Even friendships formed under pressure could be dangerous. A careless word, a remembered anecdote, could reach the wrong ears. Some chose to remain silent. Others recited revolutionary slogans aloud, over and over to protect themselves. But there was no consistent way to stay safe. A single conversation from months ago could be recalled by someone seeking their own survival. Those who tried to appeal their arrest faced more obstacles. Petitions often went unanswered. Letters were lost, ignored, or destroyed. Clerks and bureaucrats were overwhelmed, and often afraid to act against the prevailing political winds. Inside the prison, the paperwork of the revolution was relentless. Files were updated daily, lists revised, names moved from one ledger to another. Even guards sometimes didn't know the fate of their prisoners. One might deliver food in the morning and escort you to execution that afternoon. Some tried to fake illness, hoping for delay or hospital transfer, but doctors were rare and usually under orders to return all patients promptly. Others tried to disappear into the system, give false names, pretend to be someone less important, but cross-checks and interrogations were thorough, and failure to identify oneself properly was another charge. Even religion, once a source of comfort, became dangerous. Clergy were arrested en masse, churches closed, worship criminalized. To be caught praying or possessing religious texts could lead to new charges. Yet, in the darkest corners of the prison, whispered prayers still passed from mouth to mouth. Latin chants, half-remembered psalms, simple gestures of faith. The need for hope did not die easily, but the machinery of imprisonment continued without pause. Each day, new names added to rosters. Each week, new arrests arrived. The prisons filled beyond capacity, then overflowed. New facilities were commandeered. Monasteries, old schools, even abandoned estates, each one a temporary holding ground on the path to judgment or death. No one knew how long they would remain. Some survived weeks, others only hours. The only certainty was uncertainty, and the quiet knowledge that outside, the revolution turned faster than anyone could follow, taking lives with it, and leaving only silence behind. In the confined spaces of the prison, daily life became a careful performance. Every action, every word, was weighed for its consequences. There was no such thing as privacy. Not in sleep, not in speech, not even in thought. If your face betrayed you, the walls had ears, and the ears belonged to those desperate to survive. Even a look, a sigh, a question, could be reported to the guards or tribunal. Many prisoners learned to speak in code, or not at all. They communicated with glances, subtle movements, scratched symbols on a stone. Some drew playing cards from charcoal and scraps of wood to pass the time silently. Others counted bricks, paced out distances, or repeated multiplication tables aloud, just to stay sane. There were no clocks, so people used spoons or shoes to trace the light on the floor, mapping time with shadows. But time inside the prison did not pass in days or hours. It passed in names. Every morning, a guard read a list of those to be transferred or executed. The reading was slow, deliberate, and final. When your name was called, you stood, or shackled, and led away without farewell. Some prisoners tried to smile, nod at others, or whisper final words as they passed. Some screamed, some collapsed. Others begged to trade places, or cursed the tribunal with their last breath. The rest waited for the next list. This daily ritual created a strange rhythm. Each day might bring death, or another cycle of waiting, and the waiting became its own kind of suffering. Outside the cells, the guards varied from indifferent to cruel. Some demanded bribes for simple favors, like extra water, or a message carried to another cell. Others mocked the prisoners, threw scraps of food into the dirt, made them dance or sing for amusement. Abuse was frequent and unpunished. A slap for speaking out of turn, a kick for moving too slowly. Female prisoners often bore the worst of it. They were called names, touched without consent, denied even the illusion of safety. Some guards protected them, out of pity or personal interest, but nothing was guaranteed, and complaints brought retaliation. The more fortunate prisoners were those with outside connections, friends or family members who could send food, letters, or clothing. These items were inspected, sometimes stolen by guards, or sold to other inmates. A single apple might fetch a week's worth of bread. A dry shirt could mean warmth during the long, damp nights. Barter became its own underground economy. Soap for thread, meat for ink, candles for sugar. But not all prisoners had something to trade. Most arrived with nothing, and left with less. Social differences still mattered. Even in prison, nobles were recognized by their posture, their accents, their manners of speech. They were watched more closely, and often treated with more suspicion. Revolutionary songs were sometimes sung loudly outside their cells, as a warning, or a taunt. But even the most loyal revolutionaries were not safe. Those who had once cheered the fall of the monarchy, now feared for their own heads. One word spoken in the wrong tone, or one friendship too many, could place you on the list of suspects. Fear blurred the lines between factions. Everyone, regardless of belief, now shared the same cold floor, the same dirty spoon, the same silence. Before dawn, some turned to writing. If they could find paper and ink, they kept journals, composed letters to the unknown. Many of these writings were hidden, under stones, between cracks in the walls, beneath bedding. Few survived, but those that did, reveal thoughts not of grandeur or ideology, but of missing families, warm meals, open skies. The simplest things became sacred in absence. To feel wind on your face, to smell bread baking, to hold a loved one's hand. These were the luxuries most dreamed of. Not freedom, not justice, just the return of ordinary life. A few prisoners tried to entertain or uplift others. They recited plays from memory, sang old songs in low tones, drew portraits in the dust on the floor. Laughter was rare, but when it came, it startled everyone. It reminded them of life beyond the walls, and of the person they were before imprisonment. But joy was dangerous. It attracted attention. Better to be quiet, invisible, unnoticed. When a prisoner died inside the cell, from sickness, age, or despair, their body was removed quickly. There was no ceremony. No one spoke over the dead. No one wept aloud. To mourn too much was to be seen as weak, or next. So the living stayed silent, and the prison moved on without pause. New inmates arrived to fill the empty spaces, their eyes wide, their voices too loud, their questions still full of hope. The older prisoners watched them quietly, knowing that soon, they too would learn the rules of survival, rules written not on paper, but in silence, fear, and repetition, and in the unspoken truth that inside these walls, there was no justice, only endurance, waiting, and the slow passing of names through the air each morning, like a verdict carried on the breath of death itself. The guillotine itself cast a long shadow over every prison cell. It was not just a tool of execution. It was a constant presence in the minds of those imprisoned. Its name was whispered, feared, joked about in dark humor, but never far from thought. Invented in 1792, intended to be a more humane method of execution, it became the symbol of the revolution's darkest phase. Fast, mechanical, and impartial, it cared nothing for guilt or innocence. It made no distinction between king or commoner, priest or merchant, child or elder. Once condemned, your body moved through a machine of death, with practiced efficiency. At the prison, you were called out by name, then escorted to a staging cell, where you waited with others selected for execution that day. Some spent their final hours in silence, others prayed, or tried to write final messages. Guards often allowed no paper, so prisoners wrote with charcoal on scraps of cloth, or scratched words into the floor. The condemned were loaded into carts, standing or sitting, depending on their health. Some sang as they were taken through the streets, others cried out to the crowd, a few collapsed, unable to stand, held up by strangers in their final moments. The cart moved slowly, flanked by soldiers, through streets filled with spectators. Children sat on rooftops, vendors shouted prices, pamphlets were sold describing the crimes of those about to die. Many in the crowd watched silently, numb from repetition, or afraid to show emotion. A few cheered, waving revolutionary flags, calling for more heads to fall. It was theater, horror, and punishment all in one. Arriving at the execution site, prisoners were unloaded one by one. They climbed the steps of the scaffold, sometimes needing help. The executioner and his assistants worked quickly, practiced in every motion. Coats were removed, hands tied, hair cut short if needed, to expose the neck. Some prisoners resisted, had to be forced down. Others knelt voluntarily, eyes closed, breathing slowly. A wooden plank slid forward, locking them in place. Then the blade was released, falling in less than a second. The sound was sharp, final, and followed by silence or applause, depending on the crowd. Heads dropped into a basket. Bodies were removed, one after another. The entire process took only a few minutes per person. Sometimes, 20 or 30 were executed in a single afternoon. At the height of the terror, over 1,000 in a single month. The guillotine rarely paused. In Paris, it stood in the Place de la Révolution, a central location where all could see. Elsewhere, it was set up in town squares, prison courtyards, or near city gates. Blood soaked the wooden boards, the baskets, the ground itself. It was cleaned rarely, and only with water. The smell of iron and rot clung to the air. For the executioners, it became a job. They received pay, lodging, and even social status. Their assistants held the heads up for the crowd, then tossed them aside. They were feared, respected, and isolated. Some reportedly drank to cope, others developed rituals to steady their nerves. But the guillotine did not stop, not until the political winds shifted again. In prison, those not yet executed could hear the carts returning empty. They could see guards exchanging knowing looks, or whispering the next names on the list. The proximity of death was constant. Some prisoners even rehearsed their own executions, practicing last words, postures, breathing techniques to calm the body in those final moments. They had seen others falter, scream, resist. They wanted to go, though no dignity was guaranteed. There were rare delays, rain, broken equipment, paperwork errors. Some condemned prisoners were returned to their cells for a night, only to be called again the next morning. These reprieves brought no relief, only more fear and more waiting. A few prisoners were pardoned at the last minute, names crossed off the list, moments before departure, but no one knew why, or how, or who decided, and the pardoned often returned to cells filled with resentment, suspicion, or despair, because in the prisons of the French Revolution, death was not just a possibility, it was the rhythm of daily life, an invisible line that everyone approached, and most would eventually cross. The guillotine was not merely an end, it was a destination, the final station on a journey that began with a knock at the door, and ended with silence, beneath a falling blade. The architecture of the prisons was not designed for justice or rehabilitation. Most were converted buildings, never meant to hold large numbers of people. Old monasteries, royal palaces, abandoned schools, warehouses and inns. Walls were thick, ceilings low, corridors narrow and echoing. The floors were often stone or packed dirt, cold and wet beneath thin bedding. In cells there might be one small window, barred and out of reach. Little light came through, and no fresh air. Dampness collected on the walls, along with soot, mold, and layers of human grime. Some cells held a dozen or more people, crammed together with no separation for age or gender. In better rooms, a prisoner might have a bed frame, or a chamber pot, but for most, there was only straw on the floor, changed rarely, if at all. The smell of sweat, urine, infection, and fear lingered constantly. Every movement echoed in the narrow halls, footsteps, keys, coughs, cries. Doors were thick, made of iron and oak, groaning open with rusted hinges. They clanged shut with a sound that shook the walls. Inside, there were no mirrors, no clocks, no signs. Time was measured by the arrival of food, or the roll call of names. There were no private spaces, and no protection from the elements. In winter, frost gathered along the inside walls. In summer, the air turned stagnant, hot, and nearly unbreathable. Windows were rarely opened, for fear of escape or noise reaching the streets. Torches and lanterns gave dim, flickering light. Smoke filled the air, coating the lungs, adding to the choking atmosphere. Pipes, froze in winter, overflowed in storms, leaked across cell floors. Sanitation was primitive. Buckets served as toilets, emptied when someone remembered, or could convince a guard to help. Insects bred in the corners, fleas in the straw, flies around any food left too. Long lice were unavoidable, burrowed into seams and bedding, passed from prisoner to prisoner. Bathing was almost unknown. On rare occasions a basin of water was provided, but it was shared by everyone, and quickly fouled. Soap was scarce, and used for barter more than hygiene. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. One infected prisoner could infect an entire cell within days. There was no isolation ward, no medical wing, no effort to contain outbreaks. Doctors were few, and often prisoners themselves. They had no tools, no medicines, only rags and boiling water, if lucky. Even they fell ill, or were executed. Many died of untreated wounds, simple infections, or fevers brought on by exhaustion and filth. Corpses were removed quietly, sometimes left in hallways until the next morning. The building swallowed life, and gave nothing back. Guards moved through the space like shadows, opening doors, barking orders, checking lists. They knew the layout by heart, every stairwell, every corner. They had keys for every cell, and the authority to punish. On the spot, they often walked in pairs, carrying batons or muskets. Their boots marked time in the halls, a sound every prisoner learned to recognize and fear. When the guards paused outside your door, breath caught in the throat. If they unlocked it, you didn't speak, unless ordered. If they passed, you exhaled slowly, but without relief. The prison was always listening. The sound of a scream carried through floors, along stone walls, down stairwells, and no one answered. Some tried to escape, climbing chimneys, bribing guards, digging tunnels, but the buildings were old, thick with stone, and surrounded by soldiers and neighbors, eager to report any suspicious noise. Those caught were punished brutally, often executed without trial. Escape stories were told in whispers, rarely believed, never verified. Even those who managed to flee rarely found peace. They were hunted, marked, watched by committees and citizen patrols. No place was truly safe. Inside, prisoners carved markings into the walls, names, dates, initials. Some scratched tally marks, for each day survived. Others left messages, still here. Remember me, innocent. These were their only gravestones, their final voices in stone. The buildings themselves became part of the punishment. Dark, cold, crowded, loud. There was no silence, and no comfort, no softness of fabric, no clean surfaces, no safe corner to retreat to. The architecture reflected the purpose, not to hold prisoners, but to break them. Each hallway, each stairwell, each heavy door, was part of a machine of fear and forgetting. And when the revolution ended, and the prisons were emptied, the buildings remained, their walls marked, their stones still heavy with memory. Some returned to their old purposes, others were demolished, but for those who passed through them, the sound of iron on stone, the creak of the lock, and the stale air of the cell, remained in memory, long after freedom came, or did not. Even outside the prison walls, fear of arrest shaped daily life. No one was free from suspicion. Citizens carried their papers at all times. Proof of residence, loyalty, employment. Missing documentation could lead to questioning or detention. Public behavior became cautious. Performances of patriotism in every word and gesture. In markets, people spoke loudly of their support for the revolution, afraid to be overheard in silence. Posters of revolutionary leaders were displayed in windows, as insurance against accusation. Even small signs of wealth or privacy could arouse suspicion. Curtains drawn too tightly, bread purchased too early, guests visiting too late. All might be interpreted as betrayal or counter-revolutionary activity. Language itself became dangerous. Using the wrong title, calling someone monsieur instead of citizen, was enough to prompt a report. Old habits were hard to break, but forgetting them could be fatal. Children were taught to sing revolutionary songs and report suspicious behavior, even from parents or teachers. Classrooms were monitored, sermons outlawed, libraries purged of forbidden books, religious symbols removed, crosses torn from walls, church bells silenced, clergy who refused to swear loyalty to the state were arrested or driven underground. Priests hid in barns, caves, basements, saying mass in whispers to hidden congregations. To attend a secret service was to risk arrest, or worse. Social gatherings were rare, and always watched. A dinner party, without revolutionary symbols, a toast that avoided political slogans, might lead to denunciation. Friends turned against each other, neighbors spied through shutters, families split by conflicting loyalties. The Committee of Public Safety encouraged this vigilance. They distributed pamphlets, posted instructions, trained citizens to identify and report suspicious behavior. Denunciation became a civic duty. Failure to denounce was itself seen as complicity. Some denounced out of fear, others for revenge, still others for personal gain. An inheritance delayed, a rival removed, a debt forgiven by removing the debtor. The machinery of terror rewarded informants and punished those who remained silent. The prisons filled faster than they could be managed. Arrests outpaced trials, trials outpaced executions. Carts moved through the streets at night, collecting the newly accused. Doors were pounded on at midnight. Families woken by armed men with lists and orders. No explanation given. No time to prepare, just names read aloud, and hands bound for transport. Holding cells, the arrested were sometimes seen by neighbors as they left, and those neighbors often closed their windows, afraid of being associated, even by accident. Silence became the greatest safety. To show sympathy for the imprisoned, to ask about them, to suggest their innocence. These were dangerous acts. Shops removed the names of detained customers from account books. Employers replaced arrested workers without comment. Children asked not where their classmates had gone. Everyone watched, but no one spoke. In public spaces, the presence of Revolutionary Guards was constant. Street corners were patrolled. Taverns visited nightly. Printing presses inspected at random. Even inside homes, citizens lived under the possibility of search and seizure. Any paper, letter or object could be taken as evidence. A portrait of the king, a book of sermons, a foreign coin, all could be used to prove guilt. Many people destroyed letters, burned old documents, tore pages from family Bibles. They removed names from family trees, buried heirlooms in gardens, erasing their own pasts in the hope of surviving the present. Some changed their names, their accents, their occupations. They rewrote their personal histories, becoming new citizens in the eyes of the revolution. But identity could not be changed completely. A slip of tongue, a visit from someone who remembered, even an old photograph could reopen suspicion. And so many lived as shadows, speaking only when needed, trusting no one. The air in the city was tense, heavy with the knowledge that anyone, at any time, could be next. The chiming of bells no longer meant worship or celebration. It marked the hour when trials began, or when executions were scheduled. Smoke from the execution square was a daily reminder that loyalty was temporary, and safety an illusion. Even after the fall of Robespierre, and the end of the most violent months of the Terror, the effects remained. Whole families had vanished, communities hollowed out, professions decimated, silence settled over whole neighborhoods, and trust, the bond between people that holds a society together, had been broken. Inside the prisons, it was visible in every glance, and outside, in every locked door, every shuttered window, every careful smile, given to a stranger on the street, who might be watching or writing, or waiting. Women in the prisons faced a unique and often harsher reality. Their presence was not rare. Thousands were arrested during the revolution. Noblewomen, market vendors, writers, wives of accused men. Some were imprisoned for political speech, others for defending family members, some for simply refusing to conform to revolutionary expectations. The prisons did not distinguish between reasons. Once inside, women endured the same overcrowding, disease, hunger, and fear as the men. But they also faced additional threats. Privacy was even more limited. Women were often placed in cells with men, or in rooms without adequate security. There were no separate facilities, no dedicated female guards. This exposed them to constant danger, from fellow prisoners and guards alike. Sexual violence was common, and rarely acknowledged. It happened in silence, behind closed doors, or under the threat of punishment. Some women were forced to trade favors for food, water, or protection from abuse. Others endured in silence, fearing that any complaint would only worsen their situation. Pregnant women were not spared from arrest or execution. They were sometimes given brief stays, if close to childbirth. But this was inconsistent. In many cases, they gave birth inside the prison, with no doctors, no clean water, and no help beyond the kindness of fellow prisoners. Newborns slept in the same straw, breathed the same infected air, and often died within days. Some survived, carried by their mothers, until execution day. There were documented cases of infants led with their mothers to the scaffold. No exception was made, for their age, their innocence, or their inability to speak. Children older than toddlers were sometimes imprisoned on their own. especially if their parents were already arrested. They lived among adults, saw the same horrors, and were often left without care if their guardians were taken away. Young girls faced the same threats as women, without the tools to understand or resist them. And yet, women played visible roles in prison life. Many acted as caretakers, organizing food, cleaning, tending to the sick. They formed small communities, sharing what they had, reciting prayers, stories, poems. Some taught others to read or write, passed along knowledge to help fill the endless hours. In some prisons, women were the center of political discussion. Groups of arrested female activists, such as those aligned with the Girondins, debated policy, philosophy, and literature. They kept up appearances of civility, wearing what remained of proper dress, styling their hair with scraps of cloth and twine, not out of vanity, but as a quiet resistance to the conditions they faced. Others documented their time in prison through journals and letters. These writings described the daily humiliations, the fear of the lists, the fate of their friends. A few survived beyond the revolution, preserving first-hand accounts of a system built to erase them. Some women became symbols of the revolution's extremes. Marie Antoinette, once Queen of France, was held in the conciergerie. Before her execution, she was watched constantly, denied her children, and led to her death in rags and chains. Her story became emblematic, not just of fallen royalty, but of how absolute power treated those it once feared. Madame Roland, a political thinker and supporter of the Girondins, was also imprisoned and executed. She wrote powerful letters from her cell, until her final words at the scaffold. O liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name? Other lesser-known women suffered and died without record. Their stories survived only in the memories of those who watched them vanish. For those who lived through it, imprisonment became a defining scar. Survivors spoke of the silence, the despair, and the specific ways women were targeted, used, and forgotten. Even after release, those labeled as suspects struggled to return to normal life. Property had been seized, reputations destroyed, families shattered. Many women were widowed, orphaned, or left without support in a society still marked by revolution's aftermath. Some never spoke of their time inside. Others wrote, testified, or gathered in remembrance years later, but most faded from history, as anonymous victims of a system that valued loyalty over humanity. Inside the prison, being a woman meant being strong, silent, and invisible when needed. It meant surviving one more day, and helping others do the same. It meant guarding dignity in a place designed to strip it away. And waiting, always waiting, to hear whether today's names would include your own, or someone you loved. Children were not spared from the machinery of revolutionary justice. Many entered the prisons alongside their parents, taken during household arrests. Others were detained on their own, accused of political offenses, family associations, or suspected loyalties. Some were as young as infants, others barely old enough to speak. The prisons did not have separate accommodations for children. They slept on the same straw, breathed the same stale air, drank the same dirty water. They caught the same diseases: lice, dysentery, typhus. Few received special treatment. There were no toys, no books, no medical care, no education. The youngest clung to their mothers or older siblings, if they had them. Those alone were often looked after by strangers, fellow prisoners who tried to help, though they had little themselves. Crying was common, and often punished. Guards preferred silence, and the cries of children grated against the routine of fear and control. Some children learned quickly to stay quiet, to sit still, to avoid eye contact. They adapted to prison life faster than adults, but at a great cost. They witnessed beatings, illness, the announcement of death lists. They saw their caretakers disappear into execution carts, and sometimes waited alone afterward. Older children were sometimes accused directly. Sons of nobles, daughters of merchants, youth involved in political discussion or defiance. Some were denounced by neighbors, or even classmates. Patriotism was expected at every level, and no one was considered too young to be held accountable. If a boy refused to wear a tricolor cockade, or a girl spoke fondly of the king, they could be arrested under the law of suspects. There are records of children standing before tribunals. Some tried to defend themselves. Others cried silently. Most were sentenced without understanding the charges. Very few escaped conviction, and once condemned, they faced the same end, under the same guillotine, in front of the same crowds. Not all children were executed, but the trauma of imprisonment left lasting marks on those who survived. They developed chronic illnesses, nightmares, fear of crowds, mistrust of others. They spoke later of hunger, darkness, and the echo of doors slamming shut. Those too young to remember often carried gaps in their memory, a sense of loss without explanation, a fear without clear cause. Others remembered everything, with detail, too vivid for their age. There were attempts by prisoners to shield children from the worst. Women sang lullabies, told stories, played clapping games with whatever they had. They made dolls from rags, or carved shapes from bits of bread. But joy was always temporary, and fear always returned. Children watched the adults around them unravel. They saw people break down, scream, weep, stop speaking entirely. They learned when to speak, when to stay silent, how to tell if someone was about to be taken away. Their childhoods ended long before the prison doors closed behind them. In rare cases, sympathetic guards helped children survive, sneaking in extra food, turning away during punishable moments of play. But this was the exception, not the rule. Most guards ignored them, or treated them as no different from the adults they accompanied. The revolutionary doctrine did not believe in inherited guilt, officially, but in practice, children bore the burden of their family's identity. To be born of a noble, to share a surname with a merchant, to have blood linked to priests or soldiers, these alone were enough to warrant suspicion. Some children were eventually released to distant relatives, or placed in orphanages after their families were executed. Others disappeared entirely from records. There was no systematic tracking, no effort to reunite families. They became street orphans, servants, or victims of new households with their own cruelties. The prisons of the revolution were not built for children, but they held many, and for those inside, youth provided no protection, no safety, no exemption, only smaller hands, quieter sobs, and a shorter memory of life before the walls closed in, and the silence began. The Revolutionary Tribunal was the centerpiece of the legal purge. Created in 1793, it was designed to root out enemies of the Republic, but in practice, it became a conveyor belt of accusation, trial and execution. Sessions took place daily, sometimes several times per day. The accused were brought in groups, often dozens at a time. There was no jury in the modern sense, no impartial review, only a panel of judges loyal to the Committee of Public Safety. One of them, often a close ally of Robespierre or another leading Jacobin, delivered the final decision. Prosecutors like Antoine Fouquier-Tinville became notorious. They recited charges rapidly, with rehearsed certainty, rarely admitting doubt. The trial was less about facts, and more about political alignment. Evidence was thin, often nothing more than rumors, hearsay, or unsigned letters. Witnesses were unreliable, or absent altogether. The accused were often not allowed to speak at length, and when they did, they were interrupted or mocked. Defendants could request lawyers, but many were denied, and those who accepted the task risked their own arrest. The goal of the tribunal was not justice, but efficiency. In the most intense periods, verdicts were handed down in batches, 20, 30, even 60 people tried in a single session, all sentenced to die. Names were read aloud, followed by the same phrase, condemned to death by guillotine. Some sessions lasted only minutes per person, Defendants barely had time to understand the charges before being removed for execution. There was no appeals process. Once condemned, the prisoner returned to their cell only long enough to await the execution cart. Some never returned at all. Taken straight from the courtroom to the scaffold, spectators filled the galleries of the tribunal. Seats were open to the public, and the sessions became a kind of dark entertainment. Crowds watched as nobles, clergy, merchants, and peasants tried to defend themselves against the inevitable. Applause was sometimes heard, or jeers. The tribunal's purpose was to instill fear, to show that no one was above suspicion, and no one beyond punishment. Those who showed remorse were executed. Those who showed defiance also executed. Behavior mattered little. The verdict was often predetermined by factional politics or revolutionary quotas. Many judges carried out their role with grim satisfaction. Some saw themselves as protectors of revolution, defenders of liberty through terror. Others simply followed orders, knowing refusal could mean arrest or execution themselves. The tribunal operated from locations like the Palais de Justice in Paris. Its halls were lit dimly, filled with the sound of rustling papers, boots and murmurs. Prisoners were escorted in and out by guards in rows, chains clinking, heads bowed. Some entered shouting slogans, others trembling silently. A few collapsed in court, or spoke incoherently, from exhaustion and trauma. Their names were recorded in official ledgers, entered into the annals of revolutionary justice, never to be questioned again. The tribunal did not just focus on individuals. Whole groups were tried and condemned together. The Girondins, the Hébertists, the Dantonists. Each political faction, one powerful, fell when the tides shifted. Leaders were arrested. Their followers swept up, all tried in mass hearings. Their deaths were symbolic, reminders that no ideology, no position, was safe. Even Robespierre himself, once the architect of the tribunal, was eventually arrested, tried and executed by the same machine he helped build. The tribunal did not end with its creators. It continued until public outrage could no longer be ignored. By mid-1794, the sheer volume of executions, the lack of due process, the stories of innocent people killed, began to turn the public mood. After Robespierre's fall, the tribunal was reformed, then slowly dismantled. But during its most active months, it had condemned thousands. Its legacy was one of speed over substance, fear over fairness, punishment over principle. For those who passed through its doors, it was a brief stop between life and death, a place where words were meaningless, evidence irrelevant, and justice no longer part of the process. And even for those who survived, the memory of the tribunal lingered, a place of finality, where the decision was made before you spoke, and where your voice was the last thing anyone heard, before the silence returned, forever. The prisons were not quiet places. Even in the stillness of night, there were sounds, the shuffling of feet on stone, the rattling of keys, the low murmur of prayers. But most of all, there were the voices of the condemned, whispers shared between bunkmates, lists passed from cell to cell, rumors spoken in urgent tones. Every day, new names were added to the execution roll. No one knew who compiled it, or how it was decided. But the list existed, and everyone feared it. Some claimed to know how to read the signs. A visit from a certain guard, the movement of a clerk's hand, the changing of a routine. Others watched the patterns of carts, the timing of morning footsteps, the faces of prisoners taken away but never returned. In the absence of information, speculation filled the air. Who would be called next? Who had bribed their way free? Who had fallen out of favor? Even laughter could be interpreted as a sign, or a mistake. Some prisoners tried to avoid attention completely, speaking only when spoken to, never raising their eyes. Others formed tight circles, Small communities that shared resources and watched over each other. Within those groups, daily rituals emerged. Morning stretches, silent meals, shared readings from memory, anything to preserve order. In a place built on chaos, some prisoners kept lists of their own, names of the dead, names of the living. They etched them into walls, whispered them aloud before sleep. It was a way of remembering, of keeping track, of bearing witness, but the lists always changed. A name heard yesterday might not be heard again. A cellmate might be gone by dawn, and the rhythm of prison life adapted to that truth. Hope came in flashes, a rumored pardon, a letter delivered, a delayed execution cart. Some prisoners believed release was possible. They clung to news from outside, political shifts, arrests of powerful men, changes in the weather. A storm might delay the guillotine. A political speech might cause the tribunal to pause. They watched the guards closely, studied their moods, their habits, their expressions. A smile from a clerk could mean safety or doom. A delayed meal could signal confusion or nothing at all. Every detail was analyzed, measured, weighed for meaning, and still, the names came. Every day, sometimes twice a day, prisoners were called out. The voice of the guard echoed down the corridor, flat, rehearsed without feeling. Each name was a sentence. Some stood as soon as they heard it, heads high, lips pressed together. Others froze, looked to the floor, or wept quietly. Occasionally, a prisoner tried to run, or hide. It made no difference. They were always found, and taken away with force if needed. Once removed from the cell, there was no return. The remaining prisoners sat in silence, listening as the footsteps faded down the corridor. Some whispered prayers for the dead. Others remained still, until the next noise broke the silence. There were no markers for time, but each reading of names became the new measure. Not hours or days, but executions. Not meals, but absences. Not conversations, but endings. Even sleep was no refuge. Many prisoners dreamed of lists, of names read aloud in unfamiliar voices, of their own name echoing back at them. They woke with a start, sweating, unsure whether the fear had been real or imagined. In the dark, they lay still, listening for signs that the cart had returned, or the list had begun again. For some, the pressure broke the mind. They began to speak nonsense, see things that weren't there, forget their own names. Others hardened, becoming quiet, mechanical, expressionless. They moved through the day without comment, performing each task as if by instruction. A few made peace with death. They spoke of it calmly, made requests for burial, or last letters, or prayers they wished, said after they were gone. They shared memories, of better days, of family, of sunlight and music. But even these stories trailed off, as new names replaced old ones, and the cycle began again. The list ruled everything. It was not written in stone, but it was more final than any law. It changed with the whims of men. No one saw, and ended lives in silence. Those who read it had no power to change it. Those who heard it had no power to resist it. And those who escaped it one day, knew it might return with their name. The next, in this world of whispers and waiting, the only certainty was the list, and the knowledge that one day, your name might be called, and all the listening, all the hoping would come to an end, in a voice not your own, and a silence that followed behind it, without end. Even before you reached the prison, the process of arrest had already taken something from you. Your home searched, belongings confiscated, documents seized. What remained of your possessions was inventoried by revolutionary agents, item by item, down to your clothing and shoes. Anything of value was declared property of the nation. Watches, jewelry, heirlooms, taken without compensation. Books were examined for royalist ideas, letters read aloud by clerks, looking for treasonous words, family portraits destroyed, Religious items burned or locked away. If you had savings, they were frozen. If you had property, it was marked for redistribution. You arrived at the prison without rights, and without protection. Entry was documented, your name added to a ledger already overflowing. You were asked your age, birthplace and occupation. Then you were assigned a cell, based on space, not reason. The clothes you wore might be the only ones you had for the duration of your imprisonment. If they were too fine, they made you a target for guards or other inmates. If too plain, they offered no protection from the cold. Many prisoners wrapped themselves in rags, or shared blankets to survive the night. Shoes were prized, often traded, or stolen. A sturdy pair might mean the difference between withstanding the cold, or falling ill. Your name might be shortened, misspelled, or replaced entirely with a number. To the guards, you became another body in the system, and inside, identity faded. What you did before, who you loved, where you came from, all of it was suspended in the stasis of confinement. Some prisoners resisted this erasure. They carved initials into stone, wrote verses on the walls, recited their family trees at night before sleep. Others let their names go, and focused only on survival. Time passed without markers. There were no letters in or out unless approved, and approval rarely came. Mail was censored, opened, rewritten, or simply discarded without notice. Many prisoners never knew what happened to their families. Did their spouse escape? Were their children safe? Had their name been denounced too? News trickled in slowly, from new arrivals, from guards in a talkative mood, from whispers through the walls. Sometimes it was outdated, exaggerated, or entirely false, but it was all they had. Inside the cell, your world became small, your belongings, few. A spoon, a cup, maybe a cloth pouch for holding crumbs or notes. Some prisoners were allowed books, especially if they had connections, but most were not. Entertainment came from memory, poetry recited aloud, histories retold from experience, games made with stones, or wood shavings. Some made ink from burned cloth and water, wrote on walls with bits of bone. Others kept journals in their minds, repeating each day's events silently before sleep, so they would not forget. Forgetfulness was another kind of death, the disappearance of detail, of order, of the self. Those who stopped marking days, who stopped counting steps or noting faces, began to drift. They stared for hours, mumbled to themselves, or lost the ability to speak entirely. The prison consumed individuality, not with force but with repetition. The same bowl, the same straw, the same voices, the same fears. Everything that had once defined you became irrelevant. Language shifted too. The revolution changed the calendar, the way dates were written, the very names of months and days. It also changed how people spoke. You were expected to use new titles, citizen, citoyen, to express loyalty even in prison. Failure to use them could be reported as defiance. Political terms replaced personal ones. You did not say family, you said co-patriots. You did not ask about God, you asked about the Republic. But in private, among trusted cellmates, the old words remained: Mama, Papa, home, Sunday, bread. These quiet phrases, barely whispered, were acts of resistance and remembrance. Even in confinement, people found ways to maintain dignity. They cleaned their space when possible, arranged their belongings with care, offered water to the sick or dying. They washed each other's faces, shared stories of better times, sang lullabies to ease fear. Some prisoners wrote wills, naming those who should receive their few possessions if they died. A scrap of fabric, a ring hidden in a shoe, a lock of hair torn from the head before execution. These objects held meaning far beyond their value. They were reminders that they had lived, had mattered, had not vanished without trace. But most prisoners had nothing to leave behind, only their names, marked in a book, their faces seen once, and forgotten, and yet they waited each day, with what strength remained, for some sign of change. A new list. A changed guard. A message slipped through iron bars, because until the cart came for them, there was still time to remember who they were, even if no one else would ever again. Revolutionary prisons varied widely in size, structure, and reputation. Some were ancient fortresses, thick-walled and remote. Others were elegant mansions, converted hastily to hold the growing number of detainees. La Conciergerie in Paris, once a royal palace, became a central site of detention and execution. Its long stone halls echoed with footsteps. Its cells held both the powerful and the unknown. Marie Antoinette was imprisoned there, as were hundreds of lesser-known citizens. The Luxembourg Palace, with its grand architecture and high ceilings, housed aristocrats and politicians awaiting trial. Inside it was cold and overcrowded. Noble lineage offered no protection from disease or fear. Sainte-Pélagie prison held many women, especially those accused of political agitation or defying moral codes. It had once been a convent, its gardens and chapels turned into exercise yards and interrogation rooms. Other prisons had more sinister reputations. The Abbaye prison was notorious for the September massacres of 1792, when angry mobs stormed the cells and slaughtered prisoners by hand. No tribunal, no guards, just blood and panic. Bicêtre was both prison and asylum, housing the mentally ill, the poor, and those deemed politically dangerous. Its corridors were loud, its rooms filled with wailing, its air thick with despair. The Carmes convent was another religious building converted into a prison. Here clergy were kept in long rows of former monks' cells, stripped of their robes, forbidden from worship. The Rue de Sèvres prison became overcrowded within weeks, its stables used to house new arrivals. The stench of horses mixed with human waste and sickness. Each prison developed its own culture. Some were relatively quiet, ruled by strict routines and guards who kept order. Others were chaotic, filled with fighting, bribery, and violence. Conditions varied not just by building, but by who you were. A well-connected prisoner might be allowed a private room, a desk, even visitors. Others were pressed to a cell, sleeping in shifts, their belongings kept underfoot to avoid theft. In the best-equipped prisons, there were libraries, gardens, and workshops left over from earlier functions. But few prisoners had access, and those areas were often repurposed into holding rooms. As inmate numbers grew, as the terror intensified, no prison had enough space. Stairwells, chapels, even kitchens were turned into dormitories. At La Force prison, originally meant for debtors, both men and women were held in the same structure. Though separated by guards and heavy doors, the women's side became known for its unusual quiet, filled with whispered conversations, needlework, and shared poetry. But even there, executions came daily. The Temple prison, once a medieval fortress, held royal prisoners. Louis XVI, his wife, their children, they were monitored constantly, denied basic dignity, and ultimately led to trial and death. Even in the prisons outside Paris, in Lyon, Marseille, Bordeaux, conditions mirrored those in the capital. Fear dominated every wall, every routine. Executions followed closely behind. Guillotines were installed in courtyards, or prisoners were transported to public squares. For mass beheadings, outside the walls, communities lived in fear of the prison's pull. One day your neighbor was at market, the next behind bars without warning. Many prisons were located near city centers, where the public could see the daily movement of guards, prisoners, and execution carts. Children watched as the condemned were taken away. Vendors followed the carts, selling pamphlets with lists of names, accusations, and final words. Some prisons became infamous. Citizens crossed the street to avoid them, or stared with curiosity at the barred windows. Letters were smuggled in and out. Rumors spread of bribes, escapes, or secret trials. Most of these were false, but they fed the prison's mythos, making each one seem more terrifying than the last. Over time, some structures collapsed from overuse. Walls cracked from dampness, ceilings caved in under the weight of overcrowding. Others were reinforced, renovated not for comfort, but control. New locks installed, windows sealed, trapdoors added for moving prisoners unseen. The architecture was not built to last, only to contain. After the revolution, many of these prisons were abandoned, or repurposed again. A few still stand today, their stones still marked with names carved by trembling hands. Their cells open now to visitors, quiet, cold, preserved in time. But during the revolution, they were alive with footsteps, cries, prayers, and silence. And though each one was different in design, they all served the same purpose, to hold the living, until their names were read, and the guillotine waited just beyond the door. Bribery became one of the only tools of survival within the revolutionary prisons. It was not officially permitted, but it was deeply embedded in the daily workings of the system. From the moment of arrest, the process of exchange began. A coin offered to the arresting officer might buy you time to pack a bag, or to send a final message. A jewel hidden in clothing might be traded for gentler handling, or a choice of prison. Once inside, everything had a price. Food, water, blankets, paper, ink. Even a less crowded cell could be obtained for the right payment. Guards were often underpaid, poorly trained, and aware of their own vulnerability. Bribes were not only accepted, they were expected. The richer prisoners, those with connections or hidden wealth, lived differently from the rest. They received parcels from outside, wine, books, fruits, and clean linens. Their rooms, while not luxurious, were cleaner, quieter, more private. In some prisons, small kitchens were built in private cells, where inmates could cook their own food, brought in by servants or sympathetic contacts. Messages could be smuggled in cakes or sewn into hems. But even the wealthy were not safe from betrayal. A gift accepted one day might be used as evidence of conspiracy the next. Bribery was never secure, and not all guards were open to it. Some refused entirely, others demanded more, and some accepted bribes from multiple prisoners, creating confusion and false promises. There were brokers, prisoners, who acted as go-betweens. They traded favors, moved goods, passed notes, or arranged visits. They became central figures in the internal economy of prison life. They knew who had money, who was weak, who might offer something of value. Even those without wealth found ways to barter. A pair of sturdy shoes might buy extra soup. A sewing needle might be worth more than bread. A letter to a judge, if you could find someone to write it, might require days of negotiation. Sometimes, bribes reached outside the prison walls. Officials in the tribunal, clerks who handled paperwork, scribes who recorded testimonies. Their pens could add or remove names from lists, delay trials, misplace orders. But these efforts were dangerous. If discovered, bribery was treated as a political crime. The prisoner might be placed on the next execution list, the guard arrested, the intermediary beaten or silenced. And so, all exchanges were done with care. Whispers at night, coded messages, secret handoffs during roll call or meals. Even eye contact was measured. Too much could raise suspicion. Some prisoners bribed their way onto forgotten lists. Their names remained off official registers, overlooked during roundups. But this required constant payment and silence from all involved. If a new guard arrived, or a clerk was replaced, the protection vanished. Those without money relied on others. A communal fund might be collected in some cells, shared among the sick, the elderly, or the starving. But generosity had limits. Survival required hard choices, and even trusted companions sometimes withheld help out of fear or exhaustion. Attempts to bribe one's way out of prison entirely were rare. but not unheard of: smuggled uniforms, fake documents, secret doors. Each escape required multiple people, each one a potential risk, and if caught, everyone paid the price: public beatings, immediate execution, increased surveillance for all prisoners. Still, the temptation remained. For those facing death, even the smallest chance at delay was worth the cost. There were also false bribes, offers made by prisoners with nothing to give, promises of land, titles, riches hidden outside Paris. Guards sometimes believed them, only to discover there was nothing, and retaliated in anger. Others pretended to accept bribes as a trap. Once the prisoner revealed hidden possessions or plans, the information was passed up the chain of command. This created layers of fear. You could not be sure who would honor a deal, who might exploit it, or who was testing your desperation. And yet, bribery remained a thread of hope. For the condemned, it was sometimes the only tool left. Not everyone used it for survival. Some bribed guards to send messages to loved ones, or retrieve religious items, or protect others in their cell. A mother might offer her wedding ring in exchange for medicine for her child. A brother might trade his coat to keep his sister's name off the mourning list. In these moments, the prison economy showed something beyond desperation. It showed that even in a world ruled by terror, people still tried to choose mercy, to buy a few more hours of comfort, or one final act of care, before the silence returned, and the carts came again. After weeks or months in prison, the human body began to fail. Malnutrition set in quickly. Daily rations were barely enough to survive. A crust of bread, sometimes moldy, or filled with insects. A thin broth, watery, with bits of turnip or cabbage. Occasionally a sliver of meat, gristle, or bone. There was rarely enough to satisfy hunger, and meals became both a ritual and a disappointment. The strongest prisoners lost weight. The weakest collapsed. Children cried quietly after eating, their bellies full of air, not food. Adults chewed slowly, savoring what little taste remained. If food was not delivered, prisoners waited silently, then began to whisper about punishment, shortages, or the arrival of new executions. Water, too, was a source of sickness and anxiety, drawn from shared barrels, often stale, carried in rusted cans or dirty jugs. It was used for drinking, cleaning, and sometimes waste disposal. In many prisons, there were no wells, and prisoners drank what guards provided. Without question, dysentery became common. Prisoners lived with chronic diarrhea, dehydration, stomach cramps that worsened day by day. There was no privacy for illness, no chamber pots for all, no cleaning supplies, just shared corners, buckets, or the floor itself. The smell lingered always, in the halls, in the fabric of clothing, in the breath of every word spoken. Infections spread easily, cuts from rough stone, blisters from cold and damp, bruises from beatings or falls. These wounds became swollen, oozing, blackened. Gangrene set in slowly, and visibly. Fever followed, along with chills, confusion, and eventually death. Skin diseases spread from shoulder to shoulder. Rashes, boils, lice infestations, itching so severe prisoners scratched themselves raw. Hair fell out, gums bled, bones protruded through skin. Scurvy was common among long-term detainees. The lack of fresh fruit or vegetables weakened joints, opened old wounds, loosened teeth. Some could barely walk to the cell door by the time their name was called for execution. Tuberculosis moved through the corridors unseen. A cough here, a wheeze there, soon echoed through entire cell blocks. The sick were not separated. They lay beside the healthy, breathing the same air, sharing the same food. Those who cared for them became sick themselves. There were few tools for healing, no clean bandages, no antiseptics, no fresh linens, only scraps torn from old clothing, dipped in cold water, wrapped tightly and with hope. not knowledge. Medicine was nearly non-existent. Some prisoners possessed herbs or powders, smuggled in or hidden during arrest. They used these sparingly, traded doses for food or favors, or gave them away to the dying as comfort, not cure. Occasionally, a surgeon or apothecary was among the inmates. They tried to help, using bits of metal as instruments, thread for sutures, boiling water as disinfectant. But their work was done in the dark, without rest, without support, and they too were prisoners, underfed, weak, and eventually too sick to continue. The mentally ill received no care at all. They paced in circles, whispered endlessly, wept without cause. Some screamed for hours, others fell into complete silence. There were no diagnoses, no treatment plans, only chains, isolation, or disregard. Hallucinations were not uncommon. Prisoners saw shapes in the walls, heard voices of the dead, spoke to family who were no longer there. Others experienced temporary blindness, or forgot where they were. Even as the doors stood closed before them, sleep was broken, interrupted by noise, nightmares, or the physical discomfort of the floor beneath. The constant light from lanterns or torches burned behind eyelids, and the pressure of other bodies nearby left little room to rest. Some prisoners slept only in short bursts, startled awake by dreams of the guillotine, or the voice of the guard reading names in the distance. Over time, the body adjusted to the prison's pace, muscles weakened, appetite faded, thoughts slowed. The mind narrowed its focus to the cell, the food, the list, the day's end. Even the idea of freedom became abstract. It was no longer a place to return to, but a feeling remembered only in fragments. Sunlight on skin, the smell of trees, the weight of fabric not worn thin by time. Disease. A few prisoners made it out alive, but they carried these physical scars with them. Hollow faces, shrunken frames, eyes that no longer trusted silence. For many, the pain did not end with release. Injury led to permanent disability. Disease followed them for life. Memory failed to restore what had been lost, and those who died inside were rarely buried with care. Bodies were moved quickly, stacked in carts, taken to common graves without markers. The revolution did not pause to mourn them. The prison did not record them with honor. They disappeared from the ledger, from the cell, from the world beyond the walls, leaving only their silence behind, and the slow disintegration of the body that once hoped to live, even for one more day. When executions took place, they were not quiet events. They were public, scheduled, and highly visible. A spectacle designed to reinforce the authority of the revolution and the fate of those who opposed it. Each day, the cart would leave the prison at a set hour, drawn by horses, guarded by soldiers, surrounded by crowds. It rolled through the streets of Paris, over cobblestones, past shops and homes, toward the scaffold. People gathered early to secure a view of the execution. Some brought stools or crates. Others leaned from windows or climbed lampposts. Vendors arrived with baskets of bread, wine, pamphlets printed with the names and crimes of those to be executed that day. Children sat on shoulders. Couples whispered predictions. The air was filled with noise, shouting, calling, the sound of hooves and iron wheels. As the cart approached, the crowd quieted. They watched the condemned pass, standing or sitting, their hands bound, clothes torn or disheveled, faces calm, defiant, or broken. Some prisoners nodded to friends in the crowd. Some stared ahead, unmoving. A few shouted final words, for the Republic, for their families, or against the tribunal that condemned them. These words were not always heard, but they were often repeated, changed, exaggerated, or forgotten by evening. The scaffold itself stood tall and stark, built in the center of a square, often the Place de la Révolution or another busy intersection. Wooden stairs led to the platform. At the top, the guillotine waited, its frame red with dried blood, its blade polished, its basket empty or already half filled. Executioners moved efficiently. They took each prisoner by the arm, led them up the steps, positioned them on the plank. Some prisoners walked unaided, others stumbled, or were carried. Once positioned, the body was secured, the head exposed, the breath visible in the morning air. The blade fell with a loud mechanical sound, and the crowd reacted immediately. Some gasped, others cheered, many remained silent, waiting for the next name. The executioner held the head aloft, then dropped it into a basket. The body was moved aside, quickly replaced by the next. The process was fast, impersonal, designed for quantity, not drama. In the busiest days of the terror, dozens were executed in a single session. The scaffold became soaked with blood. The straw beneath turned dark and heavy. Flies gathered. The smell lingered. Yet the executions continued, day after day, week after week. Some in the crowd became familiar faces. They came not for justice, but for routine, for proof that the revolution remained in motion. Others watched in horror, or avoided the square entirely. But avoidance was not always possible. The sounds carried. The names were posted on walls. The aftermath walked through the streets on the boots of soldiers, and the stains of the cart's wheels. For prisoners inside the jails, the return of the empty cart marked the end of each cycle. They counted the number of wheels, the time it took to return, the sounds of the guards' boots. Afterward, they listened for names being spoken in the streets, or for silence, which meant someone known had been taken. Some prisoners waited for these executions with dread. Others waited for them with longing. To end the uncertainty, to pass beyond fear. There were those who prepared themselves, mentally and physically, washing their faces if water was available, fixing their clothes as best they could, saying goodbye to cellmates, or writing a name in chalk, so they would not be forgotten. There were also those who were mistaken, whose names were nearly called, whose carts turned back due to paperwork errors or delays. These moments brought no joy, only more waiting, more pacing, more meals skipped, more prayers muttered under breath. The scaffold became more than a place of death. It was a symbol of judgment, of revolution, of the terrifying finality of political failure. It replaced the courtroom, the confession booth, the grave. It spoke without voice, and decided without mercy. By the time a prisoner reached it, there was no more argument, no more appeal, only the walk up the steps, the breath before the blade, and the final drop into silence. Even after the revolution ended, and the execution slowed, and the guillotine was removed from the square, its presence lingered, in the memories, of those who watched, those who heard, and those who waited, just inside the prison doors, for their name to be read, and for the crowd to gather once more. Class determined everything before the revolution, and it determined everything inside the prison as well. The aristocracy, the clergy, the wealthy merchant class. They were among the first targets of the new revolutionary justice. To have noble blood was to be suspected of counter-revolutionary sympathy. To own land meant you had benefited from the old regime. To be educated, fluent in multiple languages, literate, cultured, all could be read as signs of privilege, and thus, guilt. Inside the prison, these social markers did not disappear. They defined your cellmates, your treatment, your chances of survival. Noble women were often recognized immediately by their manner of speech, posture, dress, even in rags, the way they held a spoon, addressed a guard, stood in line. These habits drew attention, and sometimes hostility. Some revolutionaries believed aristocrats deserved no mercy, and no comfort. They were placed in the worst cells, stripped of possessions, mocked during roll call. Others received preferential treatment, when guards could be bribed, or were themselves former servants of noble households. There were former duchesses in tiny rooms, with washerwomen, barons sleeping beside street vendors. But these moments of forced equality did not erase suspicion. Aristocrats were accused not only for who they were, but for how they spoke, how they prayed, or how they remembered their past. Even laughter could be dangerous, a reminder of old joys, or past privileges. Some nobles tried to hide their identity. They adopted common names, claimed to be tutors, governesses, tradesmen, but records were thorough, and informants numerous. A servant who knew your family name, a clerk who remembered your estate, could reveal you with a single word. Many confessed freely, preferring dignity to deception. They wore their titles even in chains, and prepared for death with the poise of the salon and the court. Merchants and business owners faced different challenges. They were accused of hoarding goods, inflating prices, exploiting the poor. To have wealth in a time of scarcity was to attract envy and danger. Their ledgers were seized, homes ransacked, employees interrogated. Inside the prison, they had few allies, too rich for the workers, too common for the nobles. They often kept to themselves, hoping to be forgotten in the shadow of larger names. Some hoped their usefulness, their knowledge of trade, law or supply, would earn them a reprieve. But usefulness was rarely enough. Even former allies of the revolution found themselves condemned for owning too much or too little. The clergy were among the most severely punished. Priests who refused to swear allegiance to the civil constitution were declared enemies of the people. Monks, nuns, bishops, all labeled threats to liberty. Inside the prisons, they were forbidden from practicing faith. Their rosaries were confiscated, masses prohibited, prayer considered sedition. Still, many prayed quietly, in whispers, in corners. In glances and gestures passed between hands and eyes. They were often isolated, kept together in former chapels or storage rooms. They sang hymns under their breath, recited scripture from memory, shared final blessings before execution. For these prisoners, class and calling were inseparable. They were not seen as individuals, but as symbols of a regime the revolution sought to destroy. At the lowest levels were the poor, arrested for theft, disorder, or association with the wrong person. They had no advocates, no possessions, and no chance to bribe or appeal. Yet they sometimes fared better than the rich. Their names were unknown, their roles in society minimal, their fates less urgent. A peasant might spend months in prison without being tried, forgotten by the system, overlooked by the lists. But this neglect was not mercy. It meant enduring every deprivation, every illness, without notice or aid. It meant dying without trial, without record, without burial. The revolution claimed to erase class, but inside the prisons, class remained visible in every cell, every bowl of food, every whispered insult. It shaped how guards treated prisoners, how prisoners treated one another, how names appeared on execution rolls. Even in the moments before death, some were addressed as Monsieur or Madame. Others were not addressed at all, and in the silence between names, class continued its quiet work, determining who sat near the door, who received a blanket, who walked first to the scaffold, and who waited behind, in the cold, with nothing except their name, and the class it revealed. Entire families were swept into prison, not as individuals, but as collective suspects. The revolution did not only target persons of power, it targeted connections, marriages, parentage, friendships. A man accused of royalist leanings could bring with him his wife, his children, his servants. A woman suspected of harboring clergy might be arrested alongside her mother and niece. There was no exemption for age, no consideration for innocence by association. The family unit, once protected by tradition, became a liability. Inside the prisons, families were rarely kept together. They were separated at intake, divided by gender, age, or available space. A father placed in one wing, a son in another, a daughter held in a separate building entirely. Attempts to stay together were sometimes met with violence. Requests to visit a spouse, to see a child, were often denied or ignored. On rare occasions, if a guard was sympathetic or bribed, brief meetings were arranged. These moments took place through iron bars, in narrow corridors, under the watchful eye of others. They lasted minutes, but lived in memory for days, or forever. Parents worried constantly for their children, not only for their physical well-being, but for their emotional survival. They tried to shield them from harsh realities, but the prison allowed few illusions. Children saw the fear in their parents' eyes, the blood on the floor, the names read aloud each morning. Mothers tried to explain death gently. Fathers tried to reassure with false promises. Older siblings became caregivers, guiding younger ones through routines, sharing scraps of food, comforting during fever or fear. There were moments of tenderness, but they were brief. A lullaby hummed softly before lights out, a joke whispered over a bowl of soup, a shared piece of bread split in 3 instead of 2. These acts sustained families longer than food or water. But over time, even the strongest bonds frayed. Despair set in, tempers shortened, silence replaced conversation. Parents blamed themselves for the fate of their children. Children blamed the world they could not understand. Some families were executed together, their names read out in a sequence, their final walk shared in the execution cart. Others were separated by trial schedules, and one returned to the cell alone, a mother without her daughter, a brother without his sister. These survivors carried the burden of memory and of absence. They recounted final words, described expressions at the scaffold, told and retold the final embrace, the last time hands touched through prison bars. Letters from family members still outside were rare, heavily censored, and often never delivered. When they arrived, they were treasured, read aloud again and again, hidden under mattresses, folded and unfolded until the paper wore thin. Some prisoners tried to write letters of their own, to children, spouses, or elderly parents, but the process required permission, materials, and luck. Most never reached their destination. A few families survived the revolution intact, through influence, bribery, or random fortune. They emerged from prison changed, their possessions gone, their homes seized, their reputations destroyed, but their unity, what little remained, gave them strength to rebuild. Others emerged alone, one child of 5, one parent of 3, one cousin from an extended household of 4. These survivors lived with memories few could understand, of meals eaten beside the dying, of lullabies turned to cries, of last walks to the scaffold that were never returned from, and of names remembered not from celebration, but from lists spoken each dawn, through the bars of a prison door, in a voice that did not care, and would not stop, until every name was crossed off, and every family was scattered, or gone. Cellmates were not chosen. They were assigned by chance, availability, and space. There were no considerations for background, temperament, age, or beliefs. You could enter a cell to find a former noble, a street vendor, a radical Jacobin, a quiet child, all pressed together, all waiting, all watching each other. There was no privacy. Every breath, every word, every motion was shared. People slept side by side on straw mats, curled against walls, heads on arms, or using shoes for pillows. The air in the room was close, filled with body heat, coughs, whispers, and dreams. The first hours with new cellmates were tense. Each tried to understand the others, to guess whether they could be trusted or feared. Some tried to remain silent. Others introduced themselves with care, using only first names, or none at all. Whispers spread quickly. Who had been in the cell the day before? Who had vanished after the last list? Who talked too much, or not enough? Old rivalries followed people in. Feuds between royalists and revolutionaries. Grievances from the marketplace. The suspicions carried from the street. But over time, A strange camaraderie could grow. Even strangers could become familiar. Daily routines created rhythm, structure where none was given. Sharing rations, helping the sick, taking turns near the small window. Prisoners played games with scraps of material, recited poetry, organized discussion groups. Some taught others to read. Others sang in soft voices at night. Stories were told again and again, of life outside, of families left behind, of what they hoped to return to. These stories helped pass the hours, and kept identity alive, but tensions could not always be avoided. Fights broke out, over food, space, rumors, or fear. Sometimes over nothing at all. Cough mistaken for an insult. A look misunderstood in the dim light. There were no guards to break up these conflicts. Cellmates policed themselves, with rules spoken and unspoken. Respect the sick, share when possible, do not steal, speak softly when others sleep. Some prisoners enforced these rules with calm authority, others with threats or strength. Power dynamics formed quickly. Those with money, with outside connections, or with influence inside the prison, often dominated the space. They controlled food, access to guards, and information from beyond the walls. In return, they offered protection, or simply silence. But these alliances were fragile. The reading of names each morning reshuffled everything. A leader today could be gone tomorrow. A quiet prisoner might suddenly be recognized, denounced, or promoted in the cell's social order. The fear of spies was constant. Anyone might report your words, twist them, pass them along to a guard or tribunal clerk. So conversations were careful, phrases vague, statements delivered with practiced ambiguity. Trust took weeks to build, and could vanish in a moment. Still, some cellmates formed genuine bonds. They shared final confessions, made promises to carry messages, if only one survived. They divided food without thought, offered a shoulder to lean on, or a hand to hold before an execution. In rare cases, friendships formed that lasted beyond the prison walls. Two survivors meeting again, years later, recognizing a voice, a gesture, a shared memory of silence and shadow. But most cellmates were together only briefly, until a name was called, and one of them stood, and the rest watched the space beside them remain empty. The next morning, no farewell could be spoken, no ceremony held, only the quiet rearranging of the bedding, the passing of a cup, the memory of who once slept near the wall. New prisoners always arrived, confused, afraid, asking questions the others could not answer, and the cycle began again. Recognition, hesitation, guarded kindness, or wary distance. The cell remained the same, though its occupants changed with every list, every cart, every whisper in the hallway. It was a place of waiting, of breathing together in fear, of learning how to live with strangers, who might be friends, or witnesses, or names that would vanish before morning, leaving only the rustle of straw, and the sound of the lock turning once more. Interrogations were not always violent, but they were always calculated. The goal was not just confession, but classification, to determine if you were an enemy, a sympathizer, a liar, or a friend to someone who was all three. The process began with questions. Simple. At first, your name, age, birthplace, occupation. Then deeper, your political opinions, your associations, your letters and correspondences, your conversations in private. Answers were recorded by clerks with quills and ledgers, scribes who wrote without comment, but listened closely. Sometimes the interrogator was a local official, sometimes a revolutionary agent, sometimes a former judge, who had sworn allegiance to the new order. They asked about events months past, people you barely remembered, statements you may or may not have made. Any hesitation could be used against you. Too quick, and it sounded rehearsed. Too slow, and it sounded suspicious. If you said nothing, silence could be interpreted as guilt. If you said too much, you might implicate someone else, or contradict an earlier version of your own story. The room was rarely private. Other prisoners might be waiting nearby, listening, learning how to answer when their time came. Guards stood watch at the door, sometimes leaned in, observing for their own reports. There were no defense attorneys, no time to prepare, no access to documents or witnesses. You could not bring evidence, or call anyone to support your case. If someone did appear on your behalf, it might raise suspicion about them, or about you. Many refused to speak at all, choosing silence as a final defense. But even that silence was recorded, noted as insolence, defiance, or lack of revolutionary spirit. Some interrogations lasted minutes, others stretched for hours, with questions repeated again and again, reshaped, reframed, reworded, until confusion set in. Sleep deprivation was common. Prisoners woken at irregular hours, marched to and from questioning in total darkness. They lost track of time, of days, of their own stories. They began to doubt their memories, their answers, even their innocence. Some were asked to denounce others, to name co-conspirators, reveal networks, identify royalists or clergy hiding among the population. Refusal to cooperate was considered obstruction. Agreeing could delay execution, or save your life, briefly, but it also meant condemning someone else. Families were often used as leverage. Interrogators threatened wives, husbands, children, suggesting they too might be arrested, or had already been taken. Some prisoners broke under this pressure, offering names, real or invented. Others held firm, even as the door closed behind them, knowing what might follow. There were also physical tactics, though less common than fear and fatigue. Long hours standing, hands bound tightly, denied food or water. Some prisoners were beaten, not as punishment, but as persuasion. Others were left in isolation, in total darkness, with no human contact for days or weeks. This sensory deprivation led to hallucinations, emotional collapse, mental confusion that made questioning easier when it resumed. There were records kept of each interrogation, pages and pages of testimony, some signed, some not. These were filed in folders, sent to the Revolutionary Tribunal, read quickly or not at all. Clerks noted satisfactory response, or evasive, or suspect tone. These summaries decided the fate of many. One sentence, one phrase written down from a long interview, used to justify execution. Some tried to outsmart the interrogators. They studied revolutionary slogans, quoted speeches, showed knowledge of the Constitution or the rights of man. But these efforts could backfire. To appear too clever, too polished, could be taken as manipulation. Genuine revolutionary enthusiasm sometimes worked. More often it was ignored, because the interrogations were not about the truth. They were about perception, and perception was shaped by fear, by quotas, by the need to demonstrate vigilance. Those who survived the process returned to their cells in silence. They spoke little of what was said. Others watched their faces, trying to read the outcome, guessing how long they had left. Some who seemed confident never returned. Others who wept during the questioning came back changed, or unresponsive, or strangely calm. The prison knew who had been called in, and who had not. Those still waiting feared each sound in the hall, each approach of boots and keys. They rehearsed answers in their minds, tried to remember exact words from weeks ago. They slept in fragments, wrote statements on walls in the dark, prayed, if they dared, because when the door opened, and the guard pointed, there was no refusal, only the walk to the questioning room, and the chance to explain yourself one more time, to someone who had already written your name, in ink that would not wash away. Water inside the prisons was not simply scarce. It was dangerous. There were no modern pipes, no filtered fountains, no guarantee of cleanliness. Water came from shared sources, barrels filled from nearby wells, rain collected from roofs, basins dipped from city pumps, and once inside the prison walls, it was handled with little care. Guards poured it into rusted buckets, cracked jars, dented pails used by dozens before you. There were no lids, no labels, no separation between water for drinking and water for washing. Some prisons had cisterns in their courtyards. Others relied on carts to bring barrels once a day. In crowded facilities, the supply ran out quickly. The first to drink got clear water, the last, only sediment, cloudy, sour, or filled with floating debris. Prisoners scooped water with tin cups, shared wooden ladles, or cupped their hands directly. These shared vessels passed lice, germs, and disease from one mouth to the next. And yet, water was needed for everything: to drink, to wash, to clean wounds, to cool fevered skin, to dampen cloths for the dying. It was rationed informally, sometimes fairly, often not. Stronger inmates might hoard it, offering sips in exchange for favors, or guarding buckets during the night. In many cells, fights broke out over water: a missed delivery, a broken barrel, a spilled pail in the night. All could lead to shouting, struggle, or worse. Guards responded with indifference or punishment. Water was not seen as a right, but a privilege to be earned or denied. In winter, barrels froze. Prisoners chipped ice with spoons or pieces of bone, melting it slowly with breath and cupped hands. In summer, the barrels warmed quickly, breeding bacteria, insects, and algae. The smell turned sour, the taste metallic or foul. Still, prisoners drank, because there was no alternative, and because thirst in prison was more than physical. It was part of the discipline, the slow wearing away of the body's strength and the mind's resistance. For those with illness, clean water was critical, but there was no way to sterilize it. No pots for boiling, no fuel for fire, no cloth for straining. A fevered prisoner might beg for a second dip, but get none. Another might sip only to vomit seconds later, the water triggering more pain than relief. Diarrhea followed unclean water, weakening the strongest, dehydrating the weak beyond return. Some prisoners tried to purify water using rags, charcoal, or sand, but the materials were scarce, and the guards disapproved of unauthorized methods. Any private use of water was viewed with suspicion. Why did you ask for more? What are you hiding? Who are you trying to help? Even requesting extra water for the sick could be twisted into a sign of favoritism or conspiracy. In rare moments, rain brought a strange kind of joy. Prisoners leaned from barred windows, held bowls or scraps of cloth into the sky. They licked water from walls, caught it in their palms, savored each drop before it touched the floor. Rainwater tasted cleaner, fresher, real. It felt like the outside world reaching in, if only for a moment. But not all prisons allowed this. Some cells had no windows, no access to courtyards, no exposure to the weather beyond thick damp stone. For them, the only water came from within, recycled through the same paths, carrying the same risks. There were no baths, no flowing taps, no concept of sanitation beyond what prisoners managed on their own. Soap was rare, towels non-existent. Hands remained unwashed after sickness or death, and the infections spread further. Skin blistered, eyes reddened, mouths cracked from dryness and fever. Some prisoners refused to drink altogether, trying to endure without it. They lasted days, then collapsed, confused, delirious, speaking nonsense, or falling into coma. Death from dehydration came silently, often mistaken for sleep, or mistaken for surrender. The guards logged it the same way: a mark in a book, a name removed from the roster, a body carted away without pause. And still the buckets returned, filled again with water from unknown sources, delivered without warning, shared without control. Water, the simplest element of life. Inside the prison, it became a source of fear, of conflict, of decay. And yet, it was needed more than anything. Each day, each hour, prisoners reached for the cup, dipped the ladle, and prayed that what they swallowed would not be the end of them, but just enough to see another day. Inside the walls, where thirst never truly ended. Sexual violence in revolutionary prisons was pervasive and largely unspoken. There were no official records, no tribunals for these crimes, no justice pursued on behalf of the victims. It was a danger faced by women, and sometimes by men, but rarely acknowledged by those in power. Women imprisoned were vulnerable from the moment of arrest, in the carts that took them to prison, in the corridors between cells, in the rooms without locks or supervision. Guards held authority over every aspect of their confinement. Food, water, warmth, even the ability to move between spaces, and that authority was abused often, in silence, in shadow, under threat of punishment or exposure. Some women were coerced into silence, a whisper of protection, in exchange for submission, a promise not to call their name for the list, if they agreed to a guard's request. Many faced no such offer, only force. There were no witnesses, and if there were, no one to tell. Speaking out was dangerous. It could mean further punishment, rougher treatment, or retaliation against someone else in the cell. Other prisoners sometimes knew, or guessed. They saw the bruises, the torn clothing, the sudden change in behavior. They said nothing, because they feared the same fate, or had seen it too many times before. In mixed prisons, or facilities without strict separation, male inmates sometimes abused women as well. Crowded conditions, shared sleeping spaces, lack of surveillance. These allowed violence to occur quietly, then vanish into the routine of prison life. Pregnancies occurred, with no explanation, no support, and no consequences for those responsible. Some women gave birth in cells, not knowing if the child would survive, or be taken, or be executed beside them. The prison system did not intervene. Midwives were rare, doctors uninterested, and records incomplete or non-existent. For some, pregnancy delayed execution, briefly, but this was inconsistent, and often only prolonged fear, hunger and illness. Young girls faced the same risks as adult women, arrested with their families, or alone, placed in cells with strangers. Guards made no distinction between age and vulnerability. The revolution had no protection for innocence, and for men who experienced sexual violence, silence was even more complete. They did not speak of it, because there were no words, and no one willing to hear them. They endured in shame, in isolation, in fear that even naming the act would bring punishment, not relief. Sexual coercion was not limited to guards, clerks, messengers. Even officials in the tribunal offices used their positions for exploitation. A promised delay in trial, a letter delivered to family, a slightly better cell. All of these became currency, exchanged for favors never spoken of aloud. Some prisoners entered the system already broken by sexual violence during arrest, pulled from their homes in the night, assaulted during transport, then discarded into the system without record. These violations were not prosecuted, not remembered, not even believed by those outside the walls. They were treated as part of the cost, the atmosphere of terror and control that defined the revolutionary prison system. Some survivors kept journals, wrote brief references in the margins of letters, described their pain without naming it. Most left no testimony at all, only silence, and the evidence of trauma written in their posture, their speech, or the children they bore without explanation. After the revolution, few spoke openly of what had happened. Even in memoirs, these acts were veiled in metaphor, hinted at, but never fully revealed. Honor demanded silence, and the world was not ready to hear what the prisons had allowed to happen. But inside the walls, in the spaces where guards came without knocking, and prisoners slept with their backs to the walls, the truth was known, and it was not justice that ruled those cells. It was power, used without restraint, and hidden in the silence of those who survived, because there was no safety, and no one listening, only the routine of fear, repeated again and again, without end. Political informants were everywhere, inside and outside the prison walls. The revolution demanded vigilance, and it rewarded those who supplied names. Informants were called by many names: observers, patriots, secret witnesses, but they were all the same: ordinary citizens, or fellow prisoners, who reported others for behavior seen as suspicious, counter-revolutionary, or simply unusual. Some did so out of genuine belief. They saw it as their duty to protect the Republic, to cleanse society of enemies, to uphold revolutionary values at all costs. Others did so out of fear, afraid that if they did not report someone, they themselves would be reported. Denouncing others became a form of self-preservation, a way to avoid suspicion, or delay their own arrest, or survive one more day inside the prison. Inside the cells, prisoners never knew who could be trusted. A friendly face might be gathering details. A quiet listener might be memorizing words for a report. Some informants were placed deliberately by authorities. They entered the prison posing as fellow detainees, engaging in conversation, encouraging confessions, taking note of names, loyalties, complaints. They asked simple questions. Where are you from? What brought you here? What do you think of the tribunal? Answers were passed along in coded messages, or whispered to guards during transfer. Other informants were turned while inside, arrested themselves, then offered better conditions, reduced sentences, or protection in exchange for cooperation: a meal, a clean shirt, an extra blanket. These could buy betrayal. The most dangerous informants were those who gave names without reason, out of jealousy, old grievances, misunderstandings, or a desire for power inside the social order of the prison. They accused others of hoarding, praying, speaking too softly, or laughing too freely. They claimed to overhear conspiracies that did not exist, or interpreted kindness as evidence of hidden wealth or guilt. The tribunal rarely questioned these reports. Even false information could justify arrest, interrogation, or execution. And the more people you accused, the more valuable you became. Some prisoners turned against friends, neighbors, even family members. Sons reported fathers, wives denounced husbands, siblings spoke against each other under pressure or for survival. Letters, intercepted by guards, became tools of accusation. A note asking about a loved one, or expressing doubt in the revolution, could be used as proof of treason. Clerks copied these letters, and the copies were used as exhibits in the tribunal. Prisoners learned to speak carefully, or not at all. They avoided opinions, avoided names, avoided history. Some spoke only in riddles, or rhymes, or coded references, shared only with the most trusted companions. But trust was rare and costly. Even years-long friendships could be severed by a single word or a rumor passed through the corridor. No one was immune. Even those who had once been informants could be accused by someone more useful to the regime. Informing did not guarantee safety. It only delayed judgment, and ensured that silence was no longer possible. Anywhere in the prison, there were moments when prisoners confronted suspected informants. Accusations whispered in corners, angry glances, sudden violence after a list came down that included a name spoken aloud days earlier. Some informants confessed, others denied. Some were protected by guards and removed from danger. But the damage was done. The presence of informants turned every cell into a place of suspicion. Every laugh became suspect. Every shared secret a potential risk. The psychological toll was immense. Prisoners isolated themselves, withdrew from interaction, chose silence over community. Paranoia grew, and even kindness was questioned. Why offer food? Why offer comfort? What do they want in return? The revolution had asked people to become the eyes and ears of the state, and they had obeyed, in numbers, in secret, in fear, and in the belief that by watching others, they might save themselves. But inside the prison, surrounded by those also accused, the informant was just another prisoner, another name, another voice, another person afraid of the list, and what came after. They were both weapon and victim, protected and doomed, a part of the system they helped sustain, and eventually, one more name to be read, when the blade needed its next soul, and the silence returned to the cell. Once more, communication inside the prison was restricted at every level. Letters to and from family were censored, delayed, or destroyed outright. Prisoners had to request permission to write. If granted, they were given scraps of paper, small amounts of ink, and a pen or broken pencil if available. They were watched as they wrote, guards stood nearby, or clerks reviewed each sentence before the page left the room. Anything that suggested disloyalty, doubt, or religious sentiment was removed. Letters that passed inspection were slow to travel. Many never arrived at all. Some were intercepted and filed with the prisoner's record, used later as evidence during trial. Others were discarded, forgotten, or stolen by those looking for valuables in envelopes. Incoming letters were treated the same. Messages from spouses, children, friends, were read and reviewed, line by line. Entire paragraphs were crossed out, or pages withheld entirely. Words of comfort were seen as dangerous. References to God, monarchy, or injustice could trigger punishment. If a letter passed the censors, it was delivered by hand, folded, and already opened, sometimes missing pieces. Prisoners read these fragments again and again, holding them as long as they could, hiding them in seams or shoes, until they fell apart from handling and dampness. Those who never received letters wondered constantly. Had their family been arrested? Had their house been searched? Were they even alive? With no news, the silence became its own torment. Prisoners turned to other forms of communication, tapping on walls, whispering through drains, passing small notes under doors or across courtyards during walks. Scraps of fabric were used as paper, messages stitched in thread, or written with soot, spit and powdered brick. Some cells created shared journals, written a line at a time by each prisoner, smuggled from room to room, and read aloud at night. These messages included poetry, memories, simple affirmations of survival, a reminder that someone nearby was listening, thinking, remembering names and voices in a place designed to erase them. But these acts were risky. Discovery meant destruction of the message, the punishment of the writer, or new charges added to the record. Guards monitored even whispered conversations, standing close during cell inspections, interrupting at random to check for contraband, eavesdropping for keywords or names of interest. Prisoners learned to speak in code, nicknames for family members, references to old books or shared meals instead of direct questions. Even eye contact became a method of communication, a glance of reassurance, a nod of warning, a shift in posture that meant not now. Some prisoners had visitors, family members allowed in under supervision, behind iron gates, or through glass. These meetings were brief, controlled, and subject to sudden cancellation without reason. Visitors were searched thoroughly, their gifts inspected, opened, or confiscated. Words had to be chosen carefully, time used wisely. Some brought clean clothes or news from outside, or simply stood and held hands through the bars for as long as they were allowed. Others broke down in tears, said too much, or left unable to return again. Inside, prisoners shared stories of these visits. They described the sound of children's voices, the color of a spouse's coat, the smell of bread brought from home. These memories were stored carefully, replayed in the mind during sleepless nights. Even when the visit lasted 5 minutes, its impact lasted for weeks. For those who had no one, or whose families could not reach them, the isolation deepened. Some received fake letters, written by fellow inmates to lift their spirits, describing imaginary news, love or hope. These fabrications were often acknowledged with a nod or a tear, and treasured anyway, because inside the prison, any word, real or false, was better than none. Communication became a form of resistance. To speak was to assert existence. To write was to create proof that you had lived, thought, remembered someone besides yourself. Even the act of listening, of hearing someone else's name, their fear, their silence, was an act of connection in a world built to sever all ties. And so, messages passed hand to hand, voice to voice, breath to breath. Some made it out, into the hands of survivors, and into history, but most were lost, unread, unheard, erased by time and paper rot, leaving only the silence behind, and the knowledge that, for a moment, someone had spoken, in hope that someone else, somewhere, might hear and remember before the doors closed again, and the list was read once more. Religion, once woven into every part of French daily life, was stripped from the prisons of the Revolution. The secular ideals of the new republic viewed faith as a threat. Clergy were among the first targeted, arrested en masse, for refusing to swear loyalty to the civil constitution of the clergy. Those who had once baptized children, married couples, and buried the dead, now found themselves behind bars. Inside the prisons, priests, monks, and nuns were placed under constant scrutiny. They were denied access to altars, scripture, or vestments. Their roles were erased, reduced to suspect, enemy, or simply prisoner. Wearing a crucifix became a political act. Possessing a rosary could result in punishment or added charges. Prayer was forbidden during inspections, discouraged in conversation, mocked by some guards, and other inmates loyal to revolutionary ideals. Still, many continued quietly. Prayers whispered during meals, signs of the cross made in darkness, hymns hummed beneath breath, while walking the corridor. Shared memory kept scripture alive. Prisoners recited psalms, gospel passages, and litanies from memory. Each line passed along, cell to cell, voice to voice. Communal prayers took place without sound. Eyes closed at the same moment, lips moving in silent rhythm. Hands linked briefly during moments of noise or distraction. Religious services were improvised. Bread saved from meals became communion. Water dipped from a cup, blessed in Latin. Words spoken into cupped hands instead of from pulpits. Confession took place behind straw mats, under beds, or spoken to cellmates who listened without judgment. Baptisms were performed in basins, with hands trembling from fear, or cold. Names given that might never be remembered outside the walls. Some priests ministered to their fellow prisoners in secret, offering blessings, absolutions, comfort in final moments before execution. Their presence brought calm to some, suspicion from others. Guards reported them. Informants listened for their Latin phrases. Tribunals noted their persistence as signs of rebellion. There were many martyrs during this time. Clergy executed not for violence or wealth, but for remaining loyal to their calling. Some were led to the scaffold in full robes, others in peasant clothes, heads high, prayers on their lips as the blade fell. Women of faith, nuns, widows, lay sisters, continued devotional life in cells. They fashioned crosses from straw or wood, lit imaginary candles with whispered blessings, fasted on remembered holy days. Despite constant hunger, for them faith was not only spiritual, it was structure, identity, resistance. In cells where the sick lay dying, prayer replaced medicine. Sacred words stood in for comfort that could not be given in touch or remedy. Even non-believers sometimes joined in prayer, not from conviction, but from fear, or memory, or the hope that words might mean something in the final hours. Religious songs passed between cells, especially at night. Ave Maria, Miserere Mei, Salve Regina. Their notes, thin and fragile, echoed off stone, rising in a place meant for punishment, not praise. The revolution replaced Christian holidays with new festivals, the worship of reason, the cult of the supreme being, civic celebrations to honor abstract principles, not divine presence. These new rites were unfamiliar, forced upon a population still shaped by centuries of Catholic tradition. Inside the prison, they were mostly ignored. The calendar changed, but prisoners still counted days to Easter, whispered about saints' days, marked the Feast of the Assumption, or Christmas with silence and memory. The presence of clergy in prison cells became symbolic, not just of faith, but of what the revolution sought to erase, a connection to the past, to community, to a moral structure larger than politics. Some prisoners clung to these figures for comfort, others avoided them, fearing guilt by association, or the attention of guards eager to punish the devout. But even those without belief often asked for a priest before execution, a final word, a last rite, an assurance whispered just before the walk to the heart. Sometimes they were granted, other times, the guards refused, or no priest was left to give the blessing. Those moments of refusal left heavy silence, words unspoken, prayers unfinished, and the cart rolled on, without answer, into the square, where the guillotine waited. After the revolution, churches reopened, priests returned to pulpits, crosses were raised again in public spaces, but in the memories of survivors, prison remained the place where belief was tested most deeply, not with argument or debate, but with hunger, fear, and silence. And in that silence, many still heard the soft murmur of prayers, a voice in Latin, a hand raised in blessing, a hymn shared by strangers in the dark. Faith, reduced to its essence, not a ritual, but a whisper, not a building, but a breath, in the face of death, still spoken, still remembered, still passed along, one prisoner to another, until the end. Execution quotas were never publicly announced, but they were understood by all who worked within the system. The revolution demanded results, evidence that enemies were being removed, and order maintained. Tribunals were expected to produce outcomes, not deliberation. That meant a steady number of convictions and executions. Each week, each month, judges, prosecutors, and prison officials felt the pressure, spoken or implied. More trials meant more deaths, and more deaths were seen as proof of revolutionary vigilance. The machinery moved quickly. Clerks processed names by the dozen, verdicts were written before hearings began. Executioners prepared daily schedules, sometimes receiving instructions in batches, 40 today, 60 tomorrow, 20 by dawn. The guillotine became a tool of logistics, not a last resort, but a centerpiece of daily operations. Scaffolds were erected in multiple cities, and in some places, used multiple times per day. In Paris, the Place de la Révolution saw blood spill so regularly that straw had to be replaced every few hours. The executioner's assistants worked in shifts, cleaning, resetting, preparing for the next cartload. Delays were rare and frowned upon. Rain, illness, or public unrest might pause proceedings briefly, but the lists always resumed. Local officials knew they were judged by how efficiently they eliminated suspects. Too few executions, and they risked accusations of leniency. Too many, and they might attract scrutiny for zealotry. But this was less dangerous than being seen as soft. As a result, names were added quickly, and with little investigation. To fill quotas, tribunals widened the net. Accusations once considered minor became fatal. Owning foreign currency, failing to display revolutionary symbols, having noble ancestors, being overheard praying, all could become reasons for death when numbers were needed. Entire families were condemned at once. Mass trials replaced individual hearings. Dozens stood in court as a group, asked a few questions, then sentenced together. In a single judgment, some prisoners were executed not because they were dangerous, but because space was needed for new arrivals. The prison system could not hold everyone. Overflow was managed not by transfers, but by removal. Execution became a method of population control. Guards learned to recognize the signs. Sudden activity in the records office, new straw in the execution cart, an early roll call. They spoke little of it, but understood what it meant. Prisoners, too, began to see the pattern. They watched the calendar, the pace of previous weeks, the number of names called each morning. Some tried to calculate their chances. Was it the third week of the month? Were yesterday's numbers low? Had a new shipment of prisoners arrived from the countryside? They guessed, hoped, feared, but never knew for certain. At times, the quotas seemed absurd. A man might be condemned one day, and his brothers spared the next, for no reason except timing. A woman might be pardoned, only to be rearrested days later. When numbers dropped again, there was no appeal, no system to correct or review the decisions. Once your name was added to the list, it was rarely removed. Executioners received their orders on paper, checked off each name as it arrived at the scaffold. It was work, grim and repetitive, and done without ceremony. They sharpened the blade, cleaned the plank, changed the straw, and waited for the cart. Inside the prisons, some prisoners spoke of these quotas openly. Others refused to believe them. They clung to the hope that justice still existed, that innocence mattered, that their time would not come simply because someone else's had not. But the numbers did not lie. In months of peak activity, thousands were executed across France, and still the lists grew. Still the guards walked the halls with torches. Still the names were read at dawn. Still the cells emptied and filled again. Some prisoners wrote about the quotas in their journals. They recorded dates, numbers, patterns, trying to understand the logic. But logic had long since left the revolution. Only momentum remained, a need to show strength, unity, control. And in that need, the quota became sacred, not in name, but in practice. And each day it was met by the turn of a page, the clatter of boots, and the sound of the blade, falling once more, without pause, without question, without end. Psychological decay inside revolutionary prisons was not immediate, but inevitable. At first, prisoners clung to structure. They recited routines from their former lives, repeated family names, counted cracks in the stone walls. They marked days with scraps of chalk, knotted threads to track weeks, listened for morning bells or footsteps as a rhythm of time. But the longer they remained, the more that structure dissolved. Sleep became fragmented, broken by noise, fear or sickness. Dreams were vivid, filled with imagined trials, voices of lost loved ones, and the sound of the guillotine falling again and again. Some prisoners woke screaming, others in silence, unsure whether they had dreamed at all. Language began to shift, thoughts slowed, sentences became shorter, memories blurred together. Even simple facts, the date, the names of siblings, the year of arrest, began to fade. Many withdrew entirely. They sat for hours without speaking, eyes fixed on a wall or the floor, unmoving unless forced to eat or drink. Others paced constantly, tracing the same few feet over and over, muttering to themselves or counting aloud in whispers. There were hallucinations. Prisoners saw family members in the shadows, heard music that wasn't there, mistook guards for priests or executioners, or old friends. Some claimed to see light where there was none, or to hear birds above a window that didn't open. Delusions could bring comfort, or despair. One man believed he had already been executed, and was living in purgatory. Another thought he was on trial every night in his sleep, arguing before an invisible tribunal that never answered. Anxiety was constant. Small noises, keys rattling, doors creaking, footsteps in the corridor, triggered panic. Prisoners froze mid-bite, dropped water cups, stood silently waiting, unsure if their name had been called. Every interruption, every visit by a guard, might mean the list was coming, or that someone had spoken against them, or that a mistake had been corrected, too late to reverse. For some, paranoia took hold completely. They trusted no one, not even those they had lived beside for months. They accused others of spying, poisoned food, false friendship. Fights broke out over glances, words, silence, or nothing at all. Even kindness became suspicious. Why did you share your bread? What do you want from me? Who told you to say that? A few tried to hold on to sanity by writing. They kept small journals, etched symbols into the walls, recited poems from memory to themselves like mantras. But paper was rare, ink difficult to hide, and writing seen by guards could lead to punishment. Some prisoners created elaborate systems in their minds, maps of their hometown, menus from their favorite cafes, family trees recalled in perfect order. They reviewed these memories again and again, polishing them like stones, fearing the day they might forget even one name, one face. Others turned to prayer, or invented rituals of their own, tapping sequences before meals, repeating lines from childhood stories, creating imaginary companions to whom they spoke when alone. But even these mental protections could fail. Prisoners began to refer to themselves in the third person, spoke to shadows, forgot the sound of their own voice. When new inmates arrived, they were often shocked by what they saw. Eyes that didn't blink, lips that didn't move, people too thin to stand, or too afraid to look away from the wall. Some cried openly, not from fear of death, but from the unbearable weight, the endless uncertainty, the erosion of time and self. There were prisoners who begged for execution, not out of guilt, but because waiting had emptied them of everything else. Their will, their hope, their identity had eroded, leaving only the desire for an end to unknowing. Others tried to take their own lives, with belts, broken utensils, glass hidden from confiscated items. Some succeeded, and were removed in silence, without record, without prayer, their names crossed out, as if they had simply been chosen early by the list. For those who remained, the walls closed tighter each day. Light seemed dimmer, air more still, silence louder, and when the guards came at last, when a name was read, and a body removed, those left behind did not cry out. They folded a blanket, rearranged a space on the floor, and returned to waiting, not because they had accepted their fate, but because the prison had removed their ability to do anything else. Psychological decay was not a collapse, it was a slow disintegration, a quiet peeling away of memory, voice, self, until nothing remained but a body, a name in a ledger, and a silence too deep for speech, waiting to be called, or forgotten. Each day in the prison began with tension, but it was the reading of names that defined the rhythm of fear. At a set hour, a guard arrived with a list. Folded pages, handwritten or copied, containing the names of those to be transferred, tried, or executed. The hallway fell silent before the first name was spoken. Prisoners sat upright, stood near the door, or remained frozen, hoping to be overlooked. The guard read in a flat voice, without inflection or explanation. Each name meant removal, and possibly death. Some prisoners cried out upon hearing their name, others nodded quietly. A few collapsed before they could stand. Those not called dared not speak. They watched, listened, counted how many were taken that morning. Sometimes 10, sometimes 30, sometimes more. The names themselves were not in any particular order. A noble beside a merchant, a widow beside a young apprentice. No pattern, no reasoning, no clues to predict the next list, and that made it worse. The unpredictability created endless speculation. Some believed the tribunal alternated, based on charges. Others said it depended on recent arrests, or the guards' recommendations, or random chance. Rumors passed through cells daily. He was called because he spoke during roll call. She gave her bread to another prisoner. They mentioned their priest in a letter. Each whisper added new fears, new theories, new rules to follow in a world with no logic. Prisoners tried to prepare themselves. They practiced what they would say if called, how they would walk, what expression to wear at the scaffold. Some left final notes behind, or gave their few belongings to others in the cell. A blanket, a spoon, a prayer book, passed quietly, without words. There were prisoners who hoped to hear their name, not because they wanted to die, but because they could no longer endure waiting. Each day without being called was another day of hunger, noise, confusion, and silence too deep to escape from. They sat by the door each morning, listening closely, hoping their name would finally free them from the unknown. Others made themselves invisible. They sat in corners, avoided conversation, tried to erase themselves from the minds of the guards and the pages of the lists. Some succeeded in staying off the list for weeks or months. Others vanished from memory, but not from fate. Names were sometimes added by mistake. A clerk confused two prisoners with similar names. A guard misheard during roll call and pointed to the wrong man or woman. By the time the cart reached the scaffold, it was too late to correct the error, and there were names that disappeared entirely. Written one day, forgotten the next, erased by a spilled inkwell, or a political shift, or the death of the person who made the accusation. These gaps left prisoners in limbo, not called, not cleared, simply waiting in cells that grew colder with each passing week. When a name was called, the other prisoners reacted quietly. Some whispered blessings, others looked away. Some reached out with a hand, a touch, a final glance. No goodbyes were allowed, no delays tolerated. The guard called again and again, until the name responded. There were nights when the lists came late, by torchlight, during supper, after all had fallen into uneasy sleep. These readings brought even more fear. No time to prepare, no daylight to walk in, only darkness, silence, and shuffle of feet toward the waiting cart. Some prisoners kept personal lists, marking who had gone, who remained. They etched names into the walls, counted gaps on the floor, memorized the rhythm of each morning's announcements. But the patterns changed too often, and names stopped meaning people, became only sounds to be feared or forgotten. For the guards, it was routine. They read names from pages handed down by the tribunal, escorted prisoners to the staging room, then returned for the next round. Some guards memorized names, others never looked at the faces, just read, pointed, opened the door. The list had no emotion, no argument, no appeal. Once spoken, the name could not be unheard. Once written, it could not be unwritten. And for those still waiting, each morning brought a mix of dread and hope that their name would be called. Hope that if it was, the waiting would end, and if it wasn't, they would face the next day with the same silence, the same fear, and the sound of another name being spoken that was not yet their own, but might be tomorrow, or the day after, or the day no one returned to speak at all. Clothing inside the prison told a quiet story of class, health, and survival. Most prisoners arrived wearing what they had on when arrested. There was no chance to pack a bag, no warning to prepare. Some came in court dresses or tailored coats, others in work aprons, nightgowns, or rags. These clothes, unchanged for days or weeks, quickly became worn, dirty, and frayed. There were no laundry services, no spare garments issued, no shoes given if yours were taken. If your coat was stolen, or your shoes lost, you had to make do or go without. Warmth mattered more than appearance. In cold months, layers were priceless. Scarves were traded for food, cloaks passed between prisoners, socks repaired again and again with thread pulled from seams. Wool was most valuable, linen less so. Lace and embroidery became symbols of danger, signs of wealth, and reasons for suspicion. Women tied cloth around their waists as belts, or made head coverings from torn skirts to protect their hair and modesty. Men with ruined trousers stitched pieces of sack to patch holes, or wrapped their feet in strips of fabric. If shoes gave out, clean clothing was rare. When it arrived, through bribes or family, it was guarded closely. Some prisoners folded these clothes neatly in their bedding, wearing them only if they thought they might be called to execution that day. They wanted to meet death dressed properly, not for vanity, but for dignity. For others, clothing became a shared resource. Those sentenced to die often gave away their garments before the end. A coat passed on to a younger prisoner, shoes left by the door, a scarf tied to a bed frame in farewell. In women's cells, prisoners helped each other with repairs. They pulled threads from seams to sew patches, used bone or bits of wood as needles, repurposed string into closures and fasteners. Each piece of clothing had its own history. A shirt worn through multiple arrests, a dress once used for mass, a jacket made for a child now wrapped around an adult's knees at night. Over time, these garments became fragile, threadbare, soaked in sweat and illness, but still worn, because nothing else was available. Hygiene was almost impossible. There was no soap, no washing basins, no drying space in the damp, crowded cells. Clothes were never cleaned, only aired briefly if sunlight was available, then worn again damp and unchanged. Odors built layer upon layer, human waste, sickness, spoiled food, embedded in fabric and flesh alike. The guards often commented on the stench, but offered no solution. Sometimes they punished prisoners for being filthy, without ever giving them water or supplies to change it. Executions changed the clothing landscape inside. After each round of deaths, prisoners watched to see what would happen to the garments left behind. Some were removed by guards, kept for themselves or resold. Others were passed around quietly, with nods of respect and grief. A coat left by a known prisoner, worn now by a stranger, connected the living to the dead in a silent practical ritual. Shoes became a sign of status. To have intact soles, dry laces, unbroken heels, meant strength, movement, a kind of power. Bare feet meant weakness, sickness, the loss of protection in a place already hostile to the body. Hats and gloves were rare. Those who had them rarely took them off. Each thread, each button, each fastening was held onto tightly, because to lose even one might mean exposure to cold punishment from a guard, or a fight over ownership. The tribunal took note of appearance during trial. Prisoners who looked too well dressed were accused of arrogance. Too poor, they were dismissed as common enemies of the people. There was no right way to appear, only wrong ways, determined after the fact. Some prisoners altered their clothing before trial, removing buttons, staining fabric, tearing hems to seem less privileged. Others did nothing, choosing to appear exactly as they were, however the tribunal might interpret it. In the end, clothing was not protection, not a shield, not a defense. It was a record of time, of suffering, of the slow wearing down of the human form. Each rip, each stain, each missing piece, a mark of days endured. And when the list was read, and the card arrived, and the door opened one final time, prisoners stepped forward, not in uniforms, but in what remained of who they were, and walked into the morning air, dressed in silence, wrapped in threadbare cloth, held together by memory, and nothing else. After death, prisoners were not mourned. There were no funerals, no eulogies, no proper burials. Bodies were removed from the scaffold, carted away quickly and without ceremony. The guillotine stood in public squares, its base dark with blood, its basket emptied often, but never cleaned with care. Once the head fell, and the crowd dispersed, the body was placed into a waiting cart, sometimes stacked with others, arms and legs folding in unnatural ways, soaked straw beneath them to catch what the wood could not. These carts moved quietly, out of the city's center, avoiding main roads, taking side paths toward the burial grounds. The dead were taken to mass graves. In Paris, one of the largest, was the Cimetière des Errances. Another, the Madeleine Cemetery, large pits dug deep, lined with lime, waiting for bodies to fill them. No coffins, no markers, no distinction between individuals, nobles beside peasants, clergy beside revolutionaries, men beside women. children, strangers. They were lowered into the trench with long poles, or pushed from the cart one by one. The smell was unbearable, the ground often muddy, flies gathering in clouds above the pit. Each day, new layers were added, until the trench could hold no more. Then a thin layer of soil was laid, and the next pit was dug beside it. Some families tried to find the graves afterward. They searched records, questioned guards, wandered the city looking for rumors or signs, but there were no names, only rough estimates, and faded memories of number executed each day. Some bribed workers to identify specific bodies, based on clothing, scars, hair color. Few succeeded, most received no closure, only silence, or a shrug, or a whispered she might be there. The dead were not remembered by the state, their names sometimes printed in pamphlets, as part of a list, with the date and a one-word crime: royalist, priest, suspect. These lists were sold on the street, read aloud in cafes, and thrown away by evening. No monuments were erected, no ceremonies held. The revolution moved too quickly for mourning. To grieve publicly was considered treason. Tears for the dead could be interpreted as support for their beliefs, and so mourning became private, hidden. A single candle lit in the night, a prayer whispered behind closed doors. Prisoners who survived remembered the sounds of the carts returning empty. They remembered the faces of those who had shared their cell, now vanished without trace. They spoke their names quietly in the weeks that followed, until they were gone from memory too. Inside the prison, belongings were claimed or destroyed. A coat worn by someone executed might be passed on to another prisoner, a final, quiet act of inheritance. Letters left behind were burned, notes discarded, writing on the walls scrubbed away to make room for the next inmate. Only a few written records survived, mostly smuggled out by clerks, sympathizers, or prisoners released before their names appeared on the list. These pages, brief notes, diary fragments, scraps hidden in hems, became the only evidence that the dead had lived at all. No bodies were exhumed, no death certificates issued. Only years later, after the terror ended, were some mass graves identified and marked: simple stones, fences, or chapels raised on the sites of thousands of unnamed dead. By then most names were forgotten. The revolution had moved on, new leaders had risen, and the prisons had emptied, then closed. But the silence remained, in the fields where grass grew above the bones, in the streets that once held crowds, in the corners of cells where no one spoke anymore. Death in the revolutionary prisons was final, not only in body, but in memory. To die there meant to disappear, to become one line in a list, one mark on a page, one turn of a wheel beneath the blade. And for the living, it meant remembering without proof, mourning without graves, and walking through a world that had learned to kill quietly, and forget quickly, as if none of it had ever happened at all.
If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more videos just